The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It came down from the high lonesome of the Coyote Ladder Ridge with the force of a judgment, carrying the taste of iron and shattered pine. This was Thistledraw, a place that spent 10 months of the year praying for water and the other 2 drowning in it. Tonight, the sky had torn open. Rain came down in sheets so dense they seemed solid, a liquid siege that turned the world's dust into a thick, sucking slurry of red mud. It was a noise that consumed all other sounds, a deafening, endless roar that hammered the hardpan, hammered the roofs, hammered the spirit. At the entrance to the Stroud Ranch, the main gate, a heavy barrier of sun-bleached timber, fought the wind on hinges that cried for tallow. It was a high, thin shriek, like something small being tortured, a sound that cut right through the storm's bass thunder. And there she stood. She had materialized from the deluge as if the storm itself had birthed her, a figure of wet wool and impossible stillness. May Callahan. She stood just outside the line of his property, her body angled against the wind, one hand gripping the top bar of the gate as if it were the only solid thing left in a dissolving world. The other hand was clamped, white-knuckled, to the handle of a heavy leather satchel. The satchel was her anchor. It was soaked through, the rich brown leather gone black, the intricate stitching at its seams straining against the weight of its secrets. Rain sluiced off the brim of her sodden hat and ran in cold rivers down her face, dripping from her chin onto the dark wool of her cloak. She didn't shiver, though the cold was a physical blow. She just stood, rooted in the mud, staring not at the house, but at the gate itself. Inside the yard, the ranch was a study in shadows and silence. Save for the storm, the great gaunt skeleton of a sycamore tree looked like a charcoal smudge against the bruised purple sky. The barn and the outbuildings were low, dark masses, hunkered down and enduring. There was no life, no movement. Only one light burned on the entire property, a single, sickly yellow rectangle glowing from the main house's porch. It didn't welcome, it accused. The beam cut a sharp, cold wedge across the yard, turning the swirling puddles into pools of spilled oil. The main house door opened. It didn't swing wide. It cracked a sliver, letting that yellow light stain the porch floorboards. A moment of silence, an assessment. Then the door swung open fully, and a man stepped out. His shadow, thrown by the light behind him, devoured the porch and stretched halfway to the gate. Ronan Stroud. He was a tall man, built as broad as the door frame he filled. He wore no hat. His dark hair was plastered to his skull by the rain in the few seconds it took him to snatch the storm lantern from its hook by the door. He wore canvas trousers and a flannel shirt. The sleeves rolled up his thick forearms despite the cold. He was a widower, and the solitude of the last 3 years had settled into him, carving lines around his mouth and leaching the color from his eyes. They were the color of ash, of a winter sky over iron, flat and empty of fire. He moved with the economy of a man who does hard labor from sunup to sundown. No wasted motion. His boots, heavy with mud, made a sucking sound on the porch boards as he descended the 3 steps into the yard. He didn't hurry. The rain was just a fact, like drought or cattle fever. He walked toward the gate, the lantern held high. Its tin and glass box swung, throwing wild, monstrous shadows that danced with the skeletal branches of the sycamore. He stopped 5 feet from the gate. On his side, she remained on hers. The lantern light caught the glint of the iron latch, slick with water. It illuminated her, freezing her in its amber glow. He saw a face, younger than he'd expected, maybe 25, but made old by exhaustion. Her skin was pale, her cheekbones sharp from hunger or fear, or both. Her eyes were hidden in the shadow of her hat. She was the one who spoke first. Her voice was a dry crackle, a sound of rust and disuse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. "Shelter," she said, just that one word, swallowed almost instantly by the wind. He didn't move. His gaze was heavy, assessing, It wasn't the face he was looking at. It was her hands. The one on the gate was raw, knuckles the color of bleached bone. The one on the satchel, that was the one that held his attention. "And work," she added, louder this time, forcing the words into the storm. "I'm looking for work." Ronan Stroud said nothing. His eyes traveled from her hand to the satchel it held. The worn flap was curled from the wet, and just at the corner, where the leather had worn thinnest, he could see the hard, square edge of what was inside. It was the corner of a book, a bound ledger, with the faint impression of ruled lines on its cover. He read signs. It was his trade. He read the sky for hail, the creek bed for water, a calf's gait for sickness. He read this woman now. She wasn't a drifter. She wasn't a saloon girl down on her luck. She wasn't a wife fleeing a husband. That grip, that bag, that hard corner, that was business. Accountants meant order. Accountants meant complications. And a woman accountant, running in a storm like this, she meant a fire. Somewhere. That was still burning. The lantern hissed. Rain spat against the hot glass. "Who's riding after you?" His voice was a low rumble. Not unkind, but devoid of softness. It was the most practical question in the world. Not, "Who are you?" or "Where you from?" but, "What trouble are you bringing?" Behind her, the road was a river of mud, disappearing into a darkness as absolute as a mine shaft. She tilted her head, a small, bird-like motion. It was a gesture of listening. He hadn't heard it, his senses dulled by the roar of the wind in his own yard. But she, who had been listening to it for miles, could feel it. A tremor, a vibration that came not through the air, but up through the ground, through the soles of her worn-out boots. Faint, miles distant, but carried clean by the wet air, the rhythmic, metallic click of shod horses on stone. It was a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Her eyes met his for the first time. They were dark, and in the lantern light, shockingly clear. "Not yet," she breathed, the word a plume of white vapor. "But they will." Ronan Stroud looked at her. He looked at the gate. He looked at the dark road she had come from, the road that led back to towns, to laws, to other men's problems. His ranch was his fortress, built not against Indians or rustlers, but against the past, against feeling. The gate kept the world out, but it also kept him in. The silence of his house was a shroud he had pulled over himself, a comfort. This woman, with her ledger and her pursuers, was a stone thrown through the ice. He thought of the empty chair at his kitchen table. He thought of the endless, silent mending, the cooking for one, the barn chores that he stretched out to fill the empty, aching hours of twilight. He was tired. He was tired right down to the marrow. "The ranch needs hands," he said, his voice flat. "But I hire cowpokes. Ma'am, not bookkeepers running from a fight." "I can ride," she said, her voice stronger now. "I can mend fence. I can cook. I'm not afraid of hands." She flexed her raw fingers on the gate. "I just need a place to stand." He let the silence stretch again, the storm filling the space between them. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw. She hadn't begged. She had offered a transaction. He took a step forward, his hand moving to the heavy wooden bar that secured the gate. He didn't lift it. His gaze was hard, direct, and held no charity. "You can stay," he said, the words sharp, clipped, "on one condition." He raised the lantern, bringing it level with his own face. The light carved him from the darkness, the deep lines, the hard jaw, the mouth that had forgotten how to smile. The rain ran down his face like tears, but his eyes were dry. "This is my land, and my house. My wife is buried up on that hill. This place, it's all that's left of her. It's quiet. I keep it quiet." He paused, letting the weight of his solitude press on her. "You ain't gonna bring your trouble into my house, and you ain't gonna bring it to my bed." It was a crude line, born of a deep, weary privacy. He wasn't propositioning her. He was warning her. He was drawing a line around his grief, around the cold, empty room that had once been the center of his life. He was a man with nothing left to give, and he would not have what little he had taken. May Callahan stood for a long second. The rain dripped from her hat brim. She understood the line. She understood the rawness behind it. She nodded. A single, sharp dip of her chin. "I came to work, Mr. Stroud," she said, her voice clear and cold as the rain. "Not to ask favors." A crack of lightning, bright as God's own forge, split the sky. It bleached the world white for one. Terrible. Silent heartbeat. In that flash, he saw her face clearly. Stripped of all shadow, her eyes were wide, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't defeated. She wasn't scared. She was just waiting. An instant later, the thunderclap hit, a physical blow that shook the ground and rattled the lantern in his hand. Before the sound had faded, Ronan Stroud lifted the heavy bar. The wood groaned. He pulled the gate inward, its bottom edge scraping a deep arc in the mud. "Get in," he said. May Callahan pushed off the gate and stumbled forward, her boots sucking at the mud. She crossed the threshold onto his land. Ronan shoved the gate closed behind her. The sound of the heavy bar dropping back into its iron brackets was a dull, final thud. It was the sound of a jail door closing or a safe being locked. He turned, not waiting for her, and began the long walk back to the house, his lantern cutting a small, defiant circle in the overwhelming dark. She, clutching her waterlogged satchel of secrets, followed in his wake. The first move of a desperate game had been played, and the gate, the boundary between the world and the widower, was closed once more. The kitchen was a cave of shadows centered on the pulsing orange heart of the cast-iron stove. Ronan Stroud did not invite her in so much as he simply walked in, leaving the door open for her to follow or freeze. She followed. Mud and water pooled around her boots, staining the wide, scrubbed pine floorboards. The storm, which had been a physical assault outside, was now a muffled roar, a constant, low-grade thunder that shook the very bones of the small house. The silence inside was thick, heavier than the cold. Ronan moved without a word. Crossing to the stove and tossing his wet hat onto a peg, he gestured to the hearth with a tilt of his chin. "Get dry." May moved toward the heat. It was a shock, a physical thing that stung her frozen skin before it soothed. Her hands, cramped into claws from gripping the satchel, slowly uncurled. She set the bag down on the stone hearth with a reverence reserved for a prayer book. It was the first time she had let go of it in what felt like a lifetime. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp of her cloak. It was heavy, weighed down with a gallon of thistle-draw's sky. As she shrugged it off, Ronan, who had turned to the stove, glanced back. He watched her. His eyes weren't leering. They were assessing, the way a man assesses livestock, looking for weakness, for sickness, for the truth. She draped the cloak over the back of a simple wooden chair, ignoring the puddle forming beneath it. Then, she turned her attention to the satchel. Her movements became precise, economical. She opened the brass clasps. Inside, damp but not soaked, was a bundle wrapped in oilskin. She unwrapped it carefully. The firelight caught the dark blue cover and the gold-tooled letters Callahan Mill. Ledger. This was her father's legacy. Not land, not money, but a history of debts and credits. A meticulous record of every bushel of wheat ground, every bag of flour sold, and, in the final pages, a meticulous record of his own ruin. The sound of metal scraping iron broke her focus. Ronan was at the stove, a long spoon in his hand, stirring the contents of a heavy black pot. The smell that rose from it was sharp, savory, and agonizingly good beans and salt pork. He ladled a thick, steaming portion into a tin bowl and set it on the small kitchen table. He didn't bring it to her. He just put it down, along with a horn-handled spoon. He took nothing for himself. He leaned his broad back against the dry sink, crossed his arms, and waited. She looked at the soup, then at him. It was a test. He was watching her, the firelight catching the flat, gray planes of his eyes. He was looking for the tells. He expected, she realized, a liar's hunger, fast, desperate, animal. May picked up the bowl. It was hot, the heat burning her palms. She brought it back to the hearth, but she didn't sit. She stood, holding the bowl in her left hand, and ate. She took one spoonful, then another, spacing them out, forcing the heat and the salt and the sustenance down. She ate like a person taking medicine, not a beggar taking charity. The silence stretched, filled only by the click of the spoon against the tin and the howling wind trying to claw its way through the chinking. Her eyes, adjusting to the dim light, scanned the room. It was a man's room, kept clean by habit rather than care. There were no curtains. The shelves held tins, sacks, and neatly stacked iron pans. And then, on the wall by the cold fireplace, she saw it. It was a shrine. Hanging from a set of pegs was a rifle, a heavy coat, and a bridle. Next to them, occupying the place of honor, hung a lady's side saddle. The leather was a deep, rich chestnut, finely tooled with a pattern of wild roses. It was immaculate, but for a fine layer of dust, as if it had been polished obsessively until the polishing simply stopped. Beside the saddle was a small, tin-framed photograph. It showed a woman, young, with dark hair piled high and a smile that seemed too bright for the gray, captured world of the image. Her head was tilted, as if laughing at the man taking the picture. It was a face full of life, a stark, painful contrast to the man standing by the sink. Elara, his wife, the woman who had died of lung fever, taking the light from this house with her. May's eyes fixed on the frame. The glass at the bottom right corner was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a single impact point. The wooden frame itself was splintered, a chip missing. It looked like it had been thrown or struck, a wound left open, unstitched. She felt Ronan's eyes on her. She had been caught staring. May dropped her gaze back to the empty bowl, her face burning. "Thank you for the soup," she said to the floor. "I saw you looking at the gate. He said—" His voice was rough, like dry gravel. She looked up. "It's sagging. The top hinge pin is loose. The latch brace is cracked." His eyebrows drew together. "You saw that in the dark, in the rain." "I see what's broken," she replied, her voice quiet. She glanced around the kitchen, then through the dark window, where a flash of lightning briefly, starkly illuminated the yard. In that single, frozen instant, her mind took inventory. "Your granary roof is patched with tin, but the north seam is peeling. Your water trough has a low water line. It's leaking at the base. The barn doors are good." She paused. "It's a lot of work for one man, especially with calving season coming on." Ronan pushed himself off the sink. He walked to the table, picked up the empty bowl, and took it back to the pot. He didn't offer her more. He was done testing her hunger. Now he was testing her motive. "What's your offer?" he asked, his back to her. 30 days, she said, the words clear and steady. 30 days of work. I can cook, I can mend, I know numbers, and I can handle stock. You saw my hands. I am not afraid of labor. 30 days, room and board. After that, I'll be on my way." He turned slowly. The firelight carved deep shadows under his cheekbones. 30 days is a long time. Trouble finds a body in 30 days. "Then it finds me," she said, "not you." He considered this. He looked at the empty chair at his table, the one his wife used to sit in. He looked at the dust on her saddle. He was a man drowning in work, a man who had chosen to bury himself in it. 20, he said. The word was final. "You give me 20 days. Good work, honest work, no trouble. On the 21st day, I decide if you stay or if you walk back down that road, rain or shine." It was a hard bargain. It was an unbalanced, arbitrary sentence, but it was also a roof. "Done," May said. The tension in the room shifted. The transaction was complete. The air was still thick with ghosts. But now there was also a contract. Ronan gestured to the door. "I'm checking the dog." He stepped out onto the porch. May heard the creak of the boards, then a low whine. A moment later, a different sound, the deep, rumbling thump-thump of a heavy tail hitting the floor. "Easy whiskey," Ronan's voice rumbled. May, alone by the fire, let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her hand, which had been clutching the spoon, moved. It didn't go to the satchel. It slipped inside the pocket of her dress, beneath her sodden skirts. Her fingers found a small, folded packet, itself wrapped in oilskin. This was the real weapon. Not the ledger, but the letter. It was addressed to the district judge in Kestrel. Inside was her sworn affidavit. It detailed, in her clean, precise accountant's hand, how Pike Lorimer, the cattle baron who claimed half the territory, had used false credit and threats to try and seize their mill, and when that failed, how his men had come in the night with torches. She could still smell the smoke, the terrifying sweetness of burning wheat. Lorimer hadn't just wanted the mill. He wanted the water. He wanted juniper wash, the stream that fed her father's mill wheel, the only reliable water source in 100 miles. The letter was her last shot, her only shot. The porch door opened, letting in a swirl of cold, wet air. Ronan stepped back in, stamping the mud from his boots. "Dog's fine," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He watched her for a moment. She had moved from the hearth. She was standing by the door where her cloak was dripping. She saw, on the peg rail, a heavy bridle. The bit was tangled in the throat latch, and it was hung on the peg meant for the hat. Ronan watched as her hands, seemingly of their own accord, reached up. Her cold, numbed fingers worked the stiff leather, untangling the bit, checking the straps, before hanging it correctly on the heavy-duty peg. She then turned, saw a short shovel leaning against the wall, its blade biting into the floorboards. She picked it up, turned it over, and leaned it against the corner properly, handle down, blade safe. Her need for order was a physical thing. It was the only armor she had left. Ronan said nothing, but his eyes followed her hands. He turned to her cloak, still slumped on the chair. "That'll mildew. Hang it by the stove." He reached down, grabbing the heavy, wet wool. It was coarser than his own, and heavier. As his hand closed on the shoulder, his thumb brushed against something small, hard and sharp, snagged in the fibers of the hem. He stopped. He worked it free with his thumb and forefinger. He held it up to the firelight. It was a horseshoe nail, not an old, rusted one dropped on the road. This one was new, shiny, with the sharp, sheared edges of a nail that had been driven, set, and then pulled out in a violent hurry. It was the kind of sign a man left when he had to ride a horse to its death, or when someone had deliberately lamed his mount. It was the proof of her words. "They will." He held the nail in his palm. The tiny piece of metal felt as heavy as a bullet. He looked at May. She stood perfectly still, her hand still resting on the smooth wood of the shovel handle. Her eyes were locked on his, on the small, incriminating piece of iron. She didn't speak. She didn't offer an excuse. She didn't plead. She simply waited for his judgment. The house was silent, save for the fire's crackle and the dying moan of the wind. He saw the road she had come from, dark and full of men. He saw the ledger on his hearth. He saw the empty chair at his table. Ronan closed his fist around the nail. He turned his hand, opened it, and tossed the nail into the wood box beside the stove. It made a small, dull tink against the kindling. "The loft in the barn is dry," he said, his voice flat. He pointed to a narrow cot in the darkest corner of the kitchen, piled with 2 rough wool blankets. "But the stove is here. You'll sleep there tonight, where I can see the door." He turned his back to her, already moving toward the stove, his shoulders set, his mind already on the next task. He picked up the heavy iron poker to bank the embers for the night. "Dawn," he said, not looking back. "You start in the calving barn." Dawn did not arrive. It seeped in. It was a slow, gray dilution of the night, cold and unforgiving. The storm had passed, leaving the air scoured and sharp, stinging the lungs. A hard frost had clamped down in its wake, plating the world in a brittle, silver rime. On the backs of the cattle huddled in the corral, the frost looked like a dusting of fine, white salt. Ronan was moving before the gray had turned to blue. May, sleeping a light, exhausted sleep on the cot, heard the scrape of his boots and the clink of the stove lid. She was up instantly, her body stiff and aching from the cold floor, her hand flying to the pocket where her letter was hidden. He was at the door, pulling on his heavy coat, a rifle in his hand. He didn't look at her. "The work's in the barn." She pulled on her still damp boots, grabbed her wet cloak, and followed him into the biting air. The cold was a slap, and the mud from the night before had frozen into a treacherous, uneven landscape of sharp ridges and icy puddles. The barn was warmer. The air was thick with the animal heat of the herd, the sweet, dusty smell of hay, and the sharp tang of manure. In the back, in the calving pens, a low, guttural sound of distress vibrated through the wooden slats. A young heifer, her first, was in trouble. She was down on her side, her body trembling, her eyes wide with white-rimmed panic. Ronan sized up the situation in a second. "She's been at it for hours. Calf's hung up." He tossed a loop of rope over a high beam and approached the heifer, his voice a low, calming rumble. "Easy now, girl, easy, just trying to help." He looped a rope around the heifer's horns and tied her fast to a post, giving her just enough slack to strain, but not to rise. Then he turned to May. She was standing at the pen's gate, her face pale in the dim lantern light, but her eyes steady. "I need your hands," he said, not as a question. "They're smaller than mine. Get that cloak off. Wash up. Bucket's there." May dropped the cloak and plunged her arms into the icy water in the feed bucket. She scrubbed with the harsh lye soap until her skin was raw and red. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. Ronan was already kneeling in the straw behind the struggling animal. "The feet are out," he said, his voice tight with effort. "But the shoulders are locked. The head's twisted. I can't get a grip to turn him." He moved aside, and May took his place. The smell was primal blood, birth and fear. She knelt in the muck. "Hold her steady," she said, her voice quiet. She took a breath, letting it out slowly, and reached in. The heat was a shock. Her cold hands, now slick, probed gently, her fingers reading the crisis in the dark. Ronan watched her face. Her jaw was set, her eyes focused on a point on the far wall. She was not in the barn. She was somewhere inside herself, a place of pure calculation. Her hands were bloody, streaked to the elbow, but they were not shaking. "The shoulder's caught on the hip," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "I need to push him back, just an inch, then twist." "She'll fight you," Ronan warned. "Then you hold her." May braced herself. She pushed. The heifer let out a great, agonized groan and strained against the ropes. Ronan put his entire weight onto the cow's neck, his voice a constant, soothing litany. "Easy, girl. Easy, hold on. Girl, easy." May's face was sheet white with her own effort. Her teeth gritted. She pushed, twisted, her fingers finding the small, slick knob of the calf's shoulder. She worked it free, a fraction at a time. Then, with a sudden, wet rush, the angle changed. "I've got him turned," she panted. "He's coming." "Get the chains," Ronan ordered, never taking his eyes off her. He took over, his large, powerful hands gripping the calf's legs, wrapping them in the small obstetrical chains. They pulled together, a two-person engine. working with the heifer's contractions. It was a silent, desperate tug of war. Their breathing fell into the same rhythm pull. Grunt, hold, pull, grunt, hold. With a final, gasping sigh from the heifer and a low curse from Ronan, the calf slid free, landing in a steaming, ungainly heap in the straw. It was still, its tongue blue. "Damn it!" Ronan spat, moving to cut the cord. "No," May said. She fell forward onto her knees. Grabbing a handful of rough straw, she cleared the calf's mouth and nose, then began to rub its ribs. Hard. "Breathe. Come on, breathe." Ronan watched her for 1 second, then grabbed another handful of straw and began rubbing the calf's other side, his touch rougher, more urgent. For a long moment, there was no sound but their harsh breathing and the frantic shush of straw on wet hide. The calf gave a convulsive shudder. It snorted, spraying fluid. Its ribs expanded in a shallow, ragged gasp. May sat back on her heels, her hands dropping to her sides. She was covered in blood and filth, shivering now that the work was done. Ronan stood up, coiling the rope. He didn't say good job. He didn't say thank you. He just nodded once at the calf, which was now trying to lift its head. "She'll clean him," he said. He untied the mother, who, exhausted, immediately turned and began to lick her baby with a low, rumbling moo. May stood and went back to the water bucket, her arms burning from the cold and the exertion. Ronan's eyes followed her. He'd seen her hands. They were calloused, yes, but the skin was finer than a ranch hand's. Yet her touch was sure. He had seen her tie off the cord with a small piece of twine. The knot she'd used was a perfect, non-slip surgeon's knot, pulled tight without strangling. A knot that wouldn't budge. He'd seen her use the knife to cut the twine. A single, clean slice. No sawing. He had hired a bookkeeper. He had gotten something else entirely. The sun was fully up now, a pale yellow wafer in the cold sky. The day's real work began. They moved from the barn to the well. The well was the ranch's lifeblood, and it was failing. The pulley squeaked a high, agonizing note with every turn, a sound that set Ronan's teeth on edge. The wooden bucket was cracked, losing a good quarter of the water on its way up. Ronan set a toolbox on the well's stone cover. "Pulley needs grease. Bucket's shot." "It's the rope, too," May said, wiping her still damp hands on her trousers. She pointed. "It's a single ply. It's stretching, and it's fraying near the hook." Ronan grunted. "It's all I had." May looked at the rope, then at the coil of new hemp rope he'd brought from the supply shed. "If you rig it single, it'll just fray again in a month. We should double it, braid it back on itself from the hook. It'll hold the weight better, and it won't twist." Ronan looked at her. He'd been rigging his own ropes for 20 years. He'd never braided one. It was finicky, time-consuming work. "You know how?" he asked. "My father's mill ran on ropes and pulleys," she said, her voice flat. "I know how." Ronan stared at her for a long beat. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face. She didn't brush it away. He picked up the new coil of rope and tossed it at her feet. "Do it," he said. He turned his back on her and began the noisy, messy work of wresting the old iron pulley from its housing. For the next hour, the only sounds were the scrape of his file against the rusted pin and the rhythmic, precise hiss of May's hands working the rope. She sat on the cold well cover, her body rocking slightly as she wove the thick strands, her fingers quick and sure. She was braiding a 4-strand round braid, a sailor's trick, strong and smooth. When he had the pulley greased and rehung, she was finished. She held up the last 6 inches, the end neatly whipped with twine. The rope was a thick, solid column, perfectly uniform. He took it without a word, tested the braid with his own powerful hands, pulling at it, trying to find a weak spot. There was none. He grunted, looped it over the pulley, and attached the new bucket. The first pull was silent. The wheel turned smoothly. The rope coiled perfectly, and the bucket came up full to the brim. Not a drop spilled. They stood for a moment, just listening to the quiet. Lunch was eaten in the sliver of shade cast by the barn. The sun was high, but the air was still cold. They didn't go into the house. They sat on an upturned trough, backs against the sun-warmed wood, and ate what Ronan had brought, thick slabs of cold cornbread and jerky. It was a companionable silence. The sweat on May's forehead had dried, leaving a salty, gritty film. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and the taste of salt, dust, and cured meat was the taste of the day. It was the taste of earned rest. This shared physical exhaustion was a proximity closer than a conversation, a bond forged in muscle and bone. While Ronan checked a horse's shoe, May's gaze drifted to the feed shed. The door was ajar. Her mind, given a moment's peace, snapped back to its old grooves. She found herself counting. 5, 6, 10 sacks of oats, maybe 50 pounds each. That's 500 pounds. He has 30 head, plus the new calves. He'll be out in 2 weeks. 3, if he stretches it. The salt licks are gone. I see only 1 block. She stopped, closing her eyes. It was a habit, this constant, anxious calculation. It was what had kept the mill alive for a year after her father's spirit had broken. "The cot's fine," she said, breaking the silence. "But I'm in your way in the kitchen." Ronan finished with a hoof, dropping it with a thump. He straightened up, his back cracking. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was wiry, tough, and she hadn't complained. Not once. She hadn't shivered. She hadn't shrunk from the blood, and she had braided a better rope than he could have. "Hayloft," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the barn's upper level. "It's clean, warmer than the house. Most nights, blankets are in the tack room." "Thank you." She stood, and as she did, she pulled a scrap of dirty cloth from her pocket. She gathered her dark, unruly hair, which had been falling in her face all morning, and with a few efficient twists, coiled it into a tight knot at the back of her head, tying the cloth scrap around it to hold it fast. It was a purely practical gesture, but in that moment, with her hair pulled back, the clean, strong line of her neck and jaw was revealed. It was a stark, unadorned beauty, a beauty of function, like a well-made tool. Ronan found himself looking away, a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his chest. As she walked toward the barn, a shadow detached itself from the porch. The old dog, Whiskey, who had watched them all morning, got to his feet. He stretched, his old bones popping, and trotted after her. He followed her up the ladder into the loft. A moment later, Ronan heard the old dog circle 3 times and flop down with a heavy sigh, his body blocking the entrance, a self-appointed guard. The afternoon light began to slant, turning the air from silver to gold. The long shadows of the ridges started their march across the valley. Ronan came out of the house carrying the Spencer carbine. It was a .56 caliber, a heavy, reliable weapon. He also carried a small wooden box of cartridges. May was coming from the chicken coop, a basket of eggs in her hand. "Set those down," he said. She did, her eyes on the rifle. "You know how to use one of F.C. Callahan's milling ledgers," he said. "Can you use one of C.M. Spencer's?" "I can shoot," she said. Shooting and hitting are 2 different things. He led her to the far side of the corral, where a line of tin cans sat on the fence. He set up a wide plank of wood against a dirt bank, 100 yards out. "This is a war rifle," he said. His voice took on a new tone. It wasn't the tired rancher. It was the sharp, clipped voice of a man who had seen war. "It's not a toy. It'll kick like a mule. So you seat it, right here." He tapped his own shoulder. "Pull it into you. Don't be shy with it. If you're shy, it'll break your collarbone." He handed her the gun. The weight of it surprised her. A solid, dense mass of walnut and steel. It was heavy. "Stance," he said. He stood behind her, but not touching her. "Feet apart. Lean into it. Like you're leaning into the wind. Good." He showed her the loading mechanism, the spring-fed magazine in the buttstock. He showed her how to work the lever, chamber around, and set the hammer. "Sights set for 100 yards. Breathe out. Find your spot. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it. Squeeze it till it surprises you." May lifted the heavy rifle. She seated the stock hard against her shoulder, just as he'd said. She leaned in, her left hand gripping the forestock, her right finding the trigger. She sighted down the barrel. The plank of wood seemed a mile away. She breathed out, letting half the air from her lungs. She found the center of the wood. She began to squeeze. The explosion was deafening. The kick was a solid, brutal punch that slammed into her shoulder, staggering her. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder filled her nose. 100 yards away, a small, dark hole appeared in the plank, 3 inches left of center. Ronan nodded. "You're pulling left. Do it again, and don't flinch." You flinched. She worked the lever, the brass cartridge ejecting with a satisfying shink. She chambered another round. She lifted the rifle. It felt heavier. Her shoulder ached. She leaned in, breathed, squeezed. Crack! This time, she was ready for the kick. A splinter of wood flew from the dead center of the plank. She lowered the rifle, her shoulder screaming, but a small, fierce smile touched her lips. Ronan took the carbine from her. "The cans," he said. He worked the lever, raised the rifle, and in a rapid, terrifying succession, fired. Crack, shink, crack, shink, crack. 3 shots. As fast as he could work the action, 3 tin cans leaped from the fence. He handed the smoking rifle back to her. "You've got 20 days, he said. "You'd best learn to be fast." He was arming her. He was acknowledging the horseshoe nail. He was acknowledging the men who were coming. As the sun finally bled away behind the ridges, they stood by the corral. The air cold and sharp. The work was done. The animals were fed. The silence of the high prairie settled around them. And then it came. Faint, high, and thin. It was the sound of the wind. But not just the wind. It was the wind moving through the jagged, narrow passes of Coyote Ladder Ridge, a place miles away. The sound was a low, rising whistle, like a distant train or a signal. Ronan, who was coiling his lariat, froze. His head came up, listening. May heard it, too. Her hand, which had been rubbing her bruised shoulder, went still. It was the sound of the high passes opening up after the storm, the sound of a trail becoming clear. It was an omen, a mournful, lonely sound that promised visitors. Ronan looked at the ridge, his face a hard mask in the twilight. "They know the passes are open," he said. He looked at May. "Get the eggs. It's time to eat." The day after the shooting lesson, Ronan rode the southern fence line. The ground, finally drying from the deluge, had turned from a sucking mire to a firm, receptive clay. It held a perfect memory. He found it near the creek bed, where the bank was lowest, a single, clear impression, pressed deep. It wasn't the smooth, worn shoe of a ranch horse or the broad, heavy print of his own draft team. This hoof had been shod with a custom-made plate, forged into the iron. Clear as a cattle brand was a small, 5-pointed star. Ronan knelt, his shadow falling over the print. He didn't need to touch it. He knew that mark. It was the signature of Pike Lorimer's chief rider. It was a stamp of arrogance, a sign that his land had been scouted, measured, and judged. The scout had come before the storm, which meant they had been watching, waiting, for a long time. The horseshoe nail May had carried hadn't been from a chase. It had been from a scout who had lamed his horse on Ronan's rocky land and had to pull the shoe to ride bare. He smoothed the print over with his glove, erasing the evidence, but the image was burned into his mind. That night, the kitchen was a drum of tension. The stove was hot, but the silence was cold. Ronan sat at the table, methodically cleaning the Spencer carbine. The metallic snick-snick of the oiled rag sliding through the barrel the only sound. He hadn't said a word about what he found. He didn't have to. May, who had been mending a grain sack, set her needle down. Her hands were steady. She stood, walked to the hearth, and retrieved her leather satchel. She placed it on the table, under the yellow lamplight, next to the disassembled parts of the rifle. Ronan stopped his cleaning. His hands, slick with gun oil, rested on the walnut stock. May unbuckled the straps. She took out the ledger. Callahan Mill. She opened it, not to the back, but to the middle pages, to the accounts from 6 months ago. Her finger, the nail clean but the knuckles split from mending the well, ran down a column. "He started small," she said, her voice quiet, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of an auditor stating facts. Flour, 10 sacks, paid in 30 days. Then oats, 20 sacks, paid in 45. She turned a page. The entries grew larger. Then he started advances, she said. Her fingers stopped. Pike Lorimer, advance against future hay yields, $500, then another 1,000, but there was no future yield. The drought was on. My father, he was a miller, not a rancher. He thought Lorimer was helping him, keeping him solvent until the rains came. She flipped to the last pages. The script, still hers, was tight, angry. He wasn't paying for hay. He was buying the debt. When the note came due, he didn't want the money. He didn't want the mill. She looked up, her dark eyes pinning Ronan in place. He wanted the water. He wanted juniper wash. There it was, the motive, the ranch, the mill, the town, none of it mattered without water. Juniper Wash was the only year-round stream in the territory that didn't dry up by August. It cut right through her father's land to run the mill wheel. With that stream, Lorimer could water 10,000 head. Without it, his empire was vulnerable. Ronan looked from her face to the ledger, paper and water, the two fluids that ran the West. He burned you out to void the contract, he stated. He burned us out to stop this, she said, tapping the ledger. And to stop me. I'm the only one who recorded the transactions as advances against water rights instead of land collateral. My father didn't see the difference. The law does. Ronan slowly, deliberately, began to reassemble the rifle. The lever clicked into place. Then they're not just looking for a woman. They're looking for a witness, and for that book. They didn't speak of it again. They acted before bedding down. They walked the perimeter. Ronan carried a coil of fine copper wire and a small canvas bag of brass bells, the kind used for trapping. May carried the signal lantern, its glass shielded with a tin sleeve. At the back fence line, the one closest to the creek, they worked without speaking. Ronan strung the wire, low to the ground, pulling it taut between 3 posts, 100 yards apart. He tied 3 bells to the center of the wire. They hung, small and silent, in the dark. Any man, walking or on horseback, would hit the wire, and the sound would carry clean to the house. May, meanwhile, climbed 20 feet up the rocky bank of the dry creek bed. She found a deep crevice, a fissure in the rock that faced the ranch house but was invisible from the trail. She set the lantern inside, its dark tin sleeve facing out. A single pull on the long cord she'd attached would rotate the sleeve, exposing the lit wick, flashing a warning signal to the house. It was a silent alarm, a backup to the bells. They were building a web. 2 days later, May rode the wagon to Barlow Bluff. It was a 30-mile round trip, a full day's journey. Ronan had loaded the wagon with the few things he had to sell: 2 cured deer hides, a wheel of hard cheese May had made, and a half-dozen smoked prairie hens. It was a plausible trip. The town was little more than a single, rutted street of false-fronted buildings, baking in the pale sun. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and the land office. May went to the store first, trading the goods for salt, coffee, and cartridges for the Spencer. Her hands were steady as she counted the change. Her real business was next. She walked to the small post office, tucked into a corner of the land office building. "Checking on a price," she said to the clerk, a man with a green eye shade and ink-stained fingers. "A parcel. Heavy, maybe 5 pounds." She patted her empty satchel for effect. "Going to Kestrel, to the district court." The clerk looked up, bored. "Registered post to Kestrel, that's $1.50. Have to be weighed. Judge Kestrel, you say he ain't been seen in a month. Circuit's got him up in the territories." May's heart sank, but she kept her face smooth. "Just planning for my employer. He's a man for details." "It'll get there," the clerk shrugged. "Eventually." She had one last stop, the Silver Slipper Saloon. It was noon, and the place was quiet, smelling of stale beer and fried fat. A lone man sat in the corner, idly plucking a 5-string banjo. She walked to the bar, ignoring the barman's raised eyebrow. She ordered a sarsaparilla. As the man turned to get it, she walked to the corner table. The man kept playing, his eyes on his fingers. He was thin, with a quick, knowing smile. Lark Delaney. He played for drinks, but he traded in whispers. "Heard you were hiring out at the Stroud place," Lark murmured, his fingers dancing through a fast reel. "He needed a hand," May said, standing over his table. "Hands, is it?" Lark's eyes flicked up at her, bright and sharp. "Funny. Pike Lorimer's hiring, too. Hired a man all the way from Arizona, a specialist." May's blood ran cold. "He's running more cattle." Lark stopped playing. The silence in the saloon was sudden and heavy. He leaned in, his voice a bare whisper. "He ain't looking for cattle. He's looking for paper. And the girl who carries it, he hired Holt Brecker." The name just hung in the air. Holt Brecker. She'd heard that name. A man who found people who didn't want to be found. A tracker. A manhunter. "Lorimer's telling everyone she's a thief," Lark whispered, his good humor gone. "Stole his ledgers. He's posted a $500 reward. Holt Brecker. He don't care if she's a thief or a saint. He just cares about the 500. Lark started playing again, a slow, mournful tune. "You best be careful, ma'am. That Stroud place is awful isolated." May put a silver dollar on his table. "For the music," she said. She walked out of the saloon, her back straight, and climbed onto the wagon seat. She got back to the ranch as the sun was touching the mountains. The long, purple shadows were like grasping fingers. Ronan was in the corral, graining the horses. He saw her face. Her eyes were bright, too bright, but her lips were pressed into a thin, white line. She pulled the wagon to a halt and spoke, her voice low and tight. "His name is Holt Brecker. He's a tracker. There's a $500 reward. They're calling me a thief." Ronan finished pouring the grain, his movements economical, unhurried. He hung the bucket on its peg. He turned to her. The last light of the sun caught the gray in his eyes. "Then we move first," he said. That night, the attack came. It was long past midnight. The moon was a sliver, the ranch buried in a tomb of silence. May was in the loft, Ronan in the house. A sharp, frantic jingle, jingle, jingle shattered the night. The bell trap. Ronan was out of the house in seconds, the Spencer carbine in his hand. He didn't run to the fence line. He ran to the corner of the barn, a deep shadow that gave him a view of the back pasture. He saw them, 2 riders, dismounted, working at the fence. They had already cut the wire. Jingle, jingle, jingle. They had stumbled into the line again, cursing. May was already at her post. From the rocks above the creek bed, a sudden, bright yellow light flashed. Once, twice, the signal. The men at the fence froze, exposed. One of them raised a rifle, firing blindly toward the house. The bullet thwacked into the barn's heavy timber, 4 feet from Ronan's head. The rider's horses, already nervous, shied violently at the flash of light from the rocks. Ronan raised the Spencer. He didn't aim at the men. He aimed at the ground. 10 feet in front of them, he fired. The heavy .56 caliber slug hit the dirt, kicking up a shower of rock and soil that stung the men's faces. The boom of the rifle echoed off the ridge like a cannon shot. It was a warning. It said, "I see you, and I can hit what I aim at." The men panicked. They scrambled for their horses, which were now rearing and pulling at their reins. They mounted in a clumsy, desperate haste, wheeled their mounts, and bolted back into the darkness. Silence, heavier than before, descended. Ronan stayed in the shadow for a full 5 minutes, his rifle up, scanning the dark. May remained hidden in the rocks. Finally, he gave a low whistle, and all clear. May climbed down, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the lantern. Ronan met her at the fence. The wire was cut clean. He lit his own lantern, keeping the flame low. He searched the ground where the men had been. "They were clumsy," he said, his voice tight with contempt. "Scared." "They'll be back," May whispered. "And they won't be scared next time. Brecker will be with them." Ronan's light glinted off something small and square, half pressed into the mud by a fleeing boot. He knelt and picked it up. It was a small, cardboard box of matches. It was damp, but the logo was unmistakable. Printed in red ink, Lorimer Cattle Company. The best beef in the territory. Ronan snapped the matchbook shut and handed it to May. "Proof." He looked at her, his face a mask of hard plains in the lamplight. "This isn't a ranch fight anymore," he said. "This is a war of paper. That judge is in Kestrel or he's not, but the land office is in Barlow Bluff. And the land office has the original survey maps." He made the decision. "At dawn, we ride. We're not just getting your letter out. We're getting a certified copy of the survey, the one that proves Juniper Wash belongs to the Callahan deed." They went back to the house. Sleep was impossible. Ronan stood guard by the window, the Spencer resting in the crook of his arm. May sat at the kitchen table. She pulled the lantern close. She took out a pen, an inkwell, and a clean sheet of paper. She dipped the pen, and her hand, which had shaken in the rocks, was now perfectly still. She began to write. "My name is May Callahan, sole heir to the Callahan mill." The scratching of her pen on the paper was a sound as sharp and as final as a rifle shot. She was turning her fear into words. She was loading her own weapon. The ride to Barlow Bluff had taken 12 hours. 12 hours of high-strained silence, of scanning the ridges, of feeling the weight of the ledgers and the affidavit in the saddlebag. They had gotten the survey map, the official ink-on-parchment proof from the land office, countersigned by a nervous clerk who clearly knew Pike Lorimer's name. They had returned to the ranch under the cover of a bruised, purple twilight, the horses lathered and exhausted. They had found no broken bells, no cut fences. The ranch was as they had left it, silent and watchful. But the tension, having been stretched wire-tight for a full day, could not simply disappear. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, waiting for a release. The release came not as thunder, but as rain. It started in the night, a soft, insistent drumming on the tin roof of the kitchen, not the violent, tearing storm of her arrival, but a spring rain, a soaking, gray melancholy. It was a rain that blurred the edges of the world, that confined them, trapping them within the small, shared space of the house and barn. The day was spent in small, necessary tasks. The fields were too wet to plow, the fences too slick to mend. It was a day for the indoors. May was in the kitchen, the scent of baking bread filling the small space. A desperate, domestic attempt to reclaim the room from the smell of gun oil and fear. Ronan was on the porch, sheltered from the downpour, his hands busy. His heavy canvas coat, soaked from the ride, was hanging on a peg near the stove. It had been steaming gently for an hour. May watched it, the way the heat rose from the shoulders. She knew he was cold. She lifted the coat from the hook. It was heavy, stiff, but warm. She buried her face in the collar for just 1 second, inhaling. It smelled of him, but more than that. It smelled of his world, the sharp, clean tang of pine pitch, the metallic bite of the Spencer carbine, and the honest, grounding scent of wood smoke. It was the smell of solid, reliable things. She carried it out to the porch. The rain was a gray, beaded curtain, the ticking sound on the roof a constant, soft rhythm. Ronan was sitting on a low stool, his broad back to her, focused on a piece of leather. He was mending the bridle, the one she had straightened on her first night. The leather was dark with tallow, his fingers slick with the grease as he worked a stiff buckle. He grunted, his thumb slipping. May stopped beside him. He didn't look up, just sensed her presence and angled his shoulder away. A subconscious gesture of privacy. "You're cold," she said. It wasn't a question. She held out the coat. He stopped working, his greasy hands hovering over the leather. He looked at the coat, then at her. He didn't want to take it. To take it was to accept care. "It's dry," she said softly. He grunted again, a sound of resignation, and reached to take it, but his hands were coated in the thick, black tallow. He couldn't. He wiped them on his trousers, but it only smeared. May saw the dilemma. Without a word, she set the coat on the dry rail, went back inside, and returned with a clean strip of white cotton, torn from a flour sack. "Here," she said. He looked at the cloth, then at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the porch's dim light. He reached for it. His slick fingers brushed hers as he took the cloth. It was a contact that lasted no more than a second, but it was electric. Her skin was cold from the kitchen. His was hot from the work. It was a spark, a jolt, as brief and as potent as a hot coal. She pulled her hand back as if stung. He took the cloth and began to meticulously, slowly, wipe the grease from each of his fingers. His gaze locked on the task, his jaw tight. Neither of them spoke. The sound of the rain filled the silence, louder now. The light began to fail. The gray day turned to a deeper gray evening. The rain did not stop. Inside, the kitchen was an island of warmth and yellow light. A pot of stew, thick with beef and barley, simmered on the stove. The heat and the moisture fogged the single window, blurring the outside world, erasing the ridges, the fences, and the threat that lay beyond. The glass was opaque, covered in condensation, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The room felt small, intimate, and charged. Ronan came in, stamping the last of the mud from his boots. He moved toward the stove, drawn by the smell. He was a large man, and in the small kitchen, he seemed to fill the space, displacing the air. May was stirring the pot, a long wooden spoon in her hand. "Done?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Almost." She tasted it. "It needs something. Salt, I think." She reached for the salt tin, her back to him. He was standing beside her. Close, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a different heat than the stove's. She was intensely aware of the 2 inches of air between her arm and his. She added a pinch of salt, stirred, and tasted again. "Let me," he said. He didn't wait for her to offer. He took the spoon from her hand. Their fingers did not touch this time, but the exchange was just as charged. He leaned over the pot. His shoulder, solid as oak, brushed hers. It was the slightest contact, just a brush of wet canvas against her wool shirt. But it sent a tremor through her. Her heart, which had been steady, gave a painful, awkward leap, hammering against her ribs. She froze. He tasted the stew, his face serious, lost in the flavor. He nodded, a small, approving gesture. "That's it." He handed the spoon back. She took it, her eyes fixed on the pot. She kept her gaze demure. focused on the task. But her pulse was a wild thing in her throat. She could feel him still standing there, his shoulder just a breath away from hers. "May?" His voice, quiet, made her jump. She turned. "Yes." He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her throat. "Your collar." She looked down. The top button of her shirt, a worn flannel thing that was probably his, had come undone. It gaped slightly, revealing the pale skin of her collarbone. She fumbled with it, but her fingers were suddenly clumsy, thick and unresponsive. "Here," he said. He lifted his hand. It was a slow, deliberate movement, respectful. He gave her time to pull away, to object. She just stood, watching his hand, his large, scarred, grease-stained fingers. He didn't touch her skin. He caught the fabric with his thumb and forefinger, his touch surprisingly deft for such a large man. He lined the button up with the hole. His knuckles, rough as bark, brushed the hollow of her throat. She stopped breathing. She was forced to look up, her chin tilted. His face was very close. She saw the new raw scratch on his cheek from their ride. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, and something else, a softness that hadn't been there before. He finished the button. His hand lingered for a fraction of a second, the warmth of his knuckles a brand against her skin. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have the air. She just exhaled. The sound was a soft, unsteady sigh. His hand dropped away. He stepped back, breaking the proximity, and turned to the water basin, his own breathing suddenly ragged. After they ate, the silence returned. But it was a new kind. It was no longer the empty, barren silence of two strangers. It was a full silence, a resonant quiet, heavy with unspoken things. The rain gentled, the ticking on the roof slowing to a meditative drip, drip, drip. May couldn't sit still. The kitchen felt too warm, too small. She opened the door and stepped back onto the porch. The night air was cold, damp and clean, tasting of wet earth and cedar. The rain had become a fine, hanging mist, a curtain of silver beads falling from the eaves. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, and leaned against the porch post, the same post he had leaned against. She felt peaceful, a strange, fragile peace. The door opened behind her. Ronan stepped out. He saw her shiver. He paused. She expected him to tell her to come inside, to not be foolish. Instead, he turned, disappeared into the darkness of the tack room, and emerged a moment later. He was carrying a heavy wool horse blanket. It was clean, smelling of hay and leather. He didn't throw it at her. He walked over and gently, deliberately, draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it was immediate, a solid, comforting pressure. The warmth was instant. It was an embrace, offered by proxy. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling the thick wool up to her chin. He didn't go back inside. He leaned on the opposite porch post, his arms crossed, looking out into the misty darkness. For a long time, the only sound was the dripping of water from the roof. "I used to hate this sound," he said, his voice a low rumble, blending with the night. The sound of a spring rain. May waited. She knew this was a confession. "My wife Ilara," he said, the name sounding rusty, as if he hadn't spoken it aloud in years. "She took the lung fever in a storm like this. It wasn't a blizzard. It was just wet and cold. She was helping me with a breech birth, drenched to the bone. She never got dry." He stared at the spot on the hill, invisible in the dark, where she was buried. "After she was gone, I just worked. I told myself the ranch needed it, but I was just burying myself. I figured if I was tired enough when I fell into bed, I wouldn't think, this whole place." He gestured to the dark expanse of his land. "It's just a big grave I dug for myself." May's heart ached for him. She understood. She pulled the blanket tighter. "My father," she said, her own voice quiet. "He didn't die in the fire. He died 3 months before it. Lorimer's notes, The drought, it broke him. He just stopped. He sat in his chair by the window and faded away. I was the one running the mill for the last 6 months. She took a shaky breath, the memory rising up, sharp and sudden. When the fire came, she whispered, I was the only one there. I stood on the hill and watched. The sound, it wasn't just wood. It was the big iron gears, the wheel shaft they warped in the heat. It sounded, her voice cracked. It sounded like metal screaming, a whole sky of it, as if the memory had summoned it. A faint, flickering ribbon of lightning illuminated the far-off ridge. A silent, ghostly flash. May flinched. A violent, full-body tremor. A small, choked sound escaped her. Her hand, resting on the porch rail, clamped into a white-knuckled fist. Ronan saw it. He didn't speak. He didn't say, it's all right. He just acted. He uncrossed his arms. He reached out and placed his large, warm hand, the one that had been greasy with tallow, completely over her clenched fist on the rail. It wasn't a caress. It wasn't a pat. It was an anchor. It was a solid, undeniable weight. It was a gesture that said, I am here. This is real. You are not on that hill. You are here. The effect was instantaneous. The trembling didn't just stop. It flowed out of her, as if his warmth was drawing the cold terror from her bones. She let out a long, shuddering sigh. Under his palm, her fist slowly uncurled, her fingers relaxing against the wood. He didn't move his hand. She didn't move hers. They stood like that, connected by that single, simple point of contact. Slowly, tentatively. May tested the air, tested the moment. She leaned her head to the side, just an inch, then 2, until her hair brushed the rough canvas of his shoulder. She rested her head there. It was a gesture of profound trust, an offering. Ronan went perfectly still. His entire body tensed, but he did not pull away, and he did not pull her closer. He just stood, solid as the post he was leaning against. He held his ground. He let her make the choice. He let her decide the distance. He was giving her the safety of his stillness. After a long, quiet moment, she lifted her head. She didn't move away. She just turned her face, looking up at him. His face was in shadow, but she could see his eyes, and they were no longer flat and gray. They were dark, and they were full of a terrible, gentle sorrow. He moved, but with a glacial slowness. He lowered his head, giving her every second, every heartbeat, to turn away. She didn't. His lips touched hers. It was the slowest, safest kiss in the history of the high plains. It was not a kiss of passion or of hunger. It was a kiss of recognition. His lips were chapped from the wind, tasting faintly of salt and coffee. They pressed against hers with a simple, solid warmth. There was no pressure, no demand. It was a commitment. It was a promise, spoken in a language older than words. I am here. You are not alone. I see you. It was respectful. It was warm. And it was, for two people who had been frozen for so long, a thaw. It lasted only a few seconds. May was the one who broke it, leaning back just enough to see his face. Her eyes were wet, glistening in the faint light from the kitchen. A small, trembling smile touched her lips. I'm still here to work, Mr. Stroud, she whispered, her voice thick. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 3 years. A smile, slow and rusty from disuse, touched his own mouth. It transformed his face, easing the hard lines, the weariness. I know, he rumbled. And I'll let you. He paused, his hand still covering hers on the rail. But while you're at it, you can work on that heart of yours, too. The land office in Barlow Bluff was a small, hot box that smelled of dust, drying ink, and the quiet desperation of property disputes. The kiss on the porch, the rain, the shared confessions, they all evaporated in the dry, pragmatic air of the law. They stood before the county surveyor's main map, a vast, sun-faded sheet of parchment that attempted to impose straight lines onto a land of curves, gullies, and ancient claims. "Here," May said, her finger tapping the map. Her voice was all business, the softness from the rainy night gone, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of her accountant's mind. "This is my father's deed, and this," she traced a blue line, "is Juniper Wash, and this," her finger landed on a small, hand-inked cross. "This is the marker, Song Swallow Rock." Ronan leaned in, his shadow falling across the map. He'd seen the rock 100 times. It was a massive sandstone overhang, 3 miles north of his own property, shaped like a bird in flight. "Lorimer's claim," Ronan said, his voice flat, "is filed against the North Fork of the creek. He says the rock is on his side of the fork." "He's lying," May said, her voice dropping. "The map is clear. The survey line follows the main wash, not the North Fork. Song Swallow Rock and the headwaters with it are deeded to the Callahan Mill. They always have been. It was all there. Lorimer's entire claim, the one he'd built his cattle empire on, was based on a deliberate misreading of the survey. He hadn't just bullied her father. He had committed a massive, foundational fraud. "You'll need a certified copy of this page," a dry voice said. They turned. A woman in a starched gray dress, her hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, stood behind the counter. This was Martha Quill, the county notary and recorder. She was a woman who had survived 2 husbands and 3 Indian raids, and she feared paper far more than she feared men. "He won't like this," Martha said, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact, like commenting on the weather. "Pike Lorimer pays to keep this office running. He considers these maps his private property." "They're public record," May countered, her chin coming up. "In a courthouse, maybe. Here, they're just suggestions. But," Martha Quill's eyes, the color of faded denim, flicked to Ronan, then back to May. "I am a sworn notary of this territory, and I follow the seal. It'll cost you $2. As Martha began the laborious process of copying the survey onto a new sheet, her hand steady, her pen scratching, she leaned in, not looking up from her work. "It's not Lorimer you need to worry about first," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "It's the man he hired, Holt Brecker." Ronan tensed. "We've heard the name." Martha Quill finally looked up. Her gaze was sharp. "You've heard he's a tracker. People think he tracks men. He doesn't. Not really. Holt Brecker tracks debt. He tracks paper. He finds miners who jump claims, ranchers who skip on loans. He can smell a ledger from 50 miles away. He's not just a bounty hunter. He's a bloodhound for a balance sheet." She looked at the satchel May was carrying, the one with the original ledger. "You're carrying what he's hunting, and he knows you're in town." A chill went through May. The attack at the fence hadn't been a random probe. They knew. Martha finished the copy, her script a perfect imitation of the original. She took her embosser, placed the seal on the paper, and slammed her fist down on it with a heavy, final thud, the seal of the territory. "There," she said, sliding the paper to May. "It's law." As Ronan paid Martha and loaded their meager supplies, coffee, flour, and cartridges, May slipped away. She moved quickly, her heart a cold knot in her chest. She went to the post office. The same bored clerk was at the window. She had the package. It was wrapped in oilskin, sealed with wax, and tied with heavy twine. Inside was Martha's certified map, her own handwritten affidavit, and the key pages from the Callahan ledger, copied word for word. "To Judge Kestrel," she said, her voice steady. "Registered." The clerk weighed it. "That'll be $1.60. May paid the coin. She did not slide the package. She held it, her hand trembling slightly. This was it. This was the arrow she was firing into the dark. It held her father's name, her future, her entire claim to justice. She pushed it through the grate. It landed on the other side with a soft, dull sound. "It'll get there," the clerk said, not looking up. Eventually, May turned and walked out. Her hands empty for the first time. She felt lighter and 1,000 times more vulnerable. The ride home was fast. They pushed the horses, Ronan's eyes constantly scanning the high ridges, the Spencer resting across his lap. They spoke little. The jingle of the harness and the clatter of the wagon wheels the only sounds. They were in Red Gully, a narrow pass of sandstone and scrub. When the shot came, it wasn't a warning. The bullet splintered the wagon's side panel, a crack thwack that was simultaneous. A second shot screamed off the iron rim of the wheel, a high-pitched zing. "Hold on!" Ronan roared. He didn't stop. He didn't reach for his rifle. He laid the whip across the horses' backs. The team surged, the wagon leaping forward, slamming May against the seat. 2 riders burst from the rocks, 50 yards ahead, blocking the pass. "It's Brecker!" May yelled, recognizing the man Lark Delaney had described lean in a long duster, riding a pale gray horse. Ronan didn't slow. He was driving the team straight at them. The men, expecting them to stop, hesitated, their horses shuffling nervously. "May the grass!" Ronan yelled. May understood. She grabbed the box of matches they'd bought, the ones from the Lorimer Cattle Company. The gully was thick with dry, cheatgrass from the summer, tinder dry. She struck a match. The wind blew it out. Another bullet snapped past her head. She shielded her hand, struck a second match, and leaned far out of the wagon, touching the flame to a high, brittle clump of grass by the trail. It didn't just catch, it exploded. A wall of pale orange flame and thick, choking, white smoke erupted, rolling across the narrow pass. The 2 riders' horses screamed and reared. Blinded by the smoke, the men were enveloped, firing wild. Ronan drove the wagon through the edge of the smoke, the heat a physical blow. They burst out the other side, the path clear. May looked back, coughing, her eyes streaming. She saw Brecker fighting his horse, his face a mask of fury, completely cut off by the smokescreen. They didn't slow for 5 miles. They ran the horses until their flanks were dark with sweat, until the wagon rattled so hard May thought it would shake apart. They had escaped, but they both knew the game had changed. This was no longer a threat. It was an active hunt. They arrived at the Stroud Ranch as twilight bled into the sky. The silence was absolute. Whiskey, the old dog, met them at the gate, but he wasn't wagging his tail. He was whining, low in his throat, his hackles raised. "What is it, boy?" Ronan said, climbing down, the rifle in his hand. He saw it first. May saw it a second later, and she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The red stakes. There were a dozen of them, hammered deep into the ground, running from the gate all along his fence line. The paint was still wet, gleaming like fresh blood in the dusk. Each stake was sharp, brutal, a violation. They were the markers of a new survey, Lorimer's survey. They were a declaration, "This is already mine." That night, the neighbors came. Ronan had ridden out, a silent, grim shadow, and summoned them. They gathered in his kitchen, the air thick with tension, coffee, and the smell of fear. Inez Hollow, a widow whose small sheep ranch bordered Lorimer's land, her hands knotted with arthritis and work. Boaz McKendry, the town blacksmith, a mountain of a man with a quiet voice and furious eyes, who shoed their horses and knew Lorimer's men were running roughshod. And Teller Dunn, a silent, watchful prospector who lived in the hills and depended, like everyone, on the water Lorimer was slowly strangling. They were the Water Alliance, a small, desperate coalition of the freeholders Lorimer was trying to crush. Ronan laid it out, the star hoof print, the attack on May, the fraudulent map. "He'll dry us all out by summer," Inez said, her voice shaking. "He's already dammed the South Fork. My spring is down to a trickle." "We can't fight his riders. Stroud?" Boaz said, his big hands curling into fists. "He's got 20 guns. We've got this." He motioned to the 4 of them. "We don't have to," May said, stepping forward. All eyes turned to her. She unrolled the copy of the map on the table. "We fight him 2 ways," she said, her voice clear and strong. She was no longer a refugee. She was a general. "First, with the law." She tapped the map. "I've sent this and my affidavit to Judge Kestrel. It's the slow arrow. It's on its way. But it will take weeks. We don't have weeks." "So what's the fast arrow?" Ronan asked, his eyes dark with a new, fierce pride, never leaving her face. "Brecker," May said. "Martha Quill said he tracks paper, but he's still a tracker. He's looking for the source. He's looking for Juniper Wash. So we give him one." "What?" Teller Dunn, the miner, spoke for the first time. "A fake," May said. "A diversion. Teller, you know the high ridges. Is there another spring, something small, useless, but wet? Something that looks good on paper?" Teller thought for a moment, pulling at his beard. "Aye, up in Cinder Pocket. It's alkali water. Poison. But it's wet. Looks like a real gusher till you taste it." "Good," May said. "Boaz, tomorrow. You'll overhear in the saloon that the Stroud Ranch's well is failing, and that Ronan is looking to buy access to that new spring in Cinder Pocket. Inez, you'll complain that he's trying to outbid you for it." "It's a rumor," Ronan said, a slow smile spreading. "A piece of paper for Brecker to chase." "Exactly," May said. "We'll lead him on a wild goose chase. We'll make him track a phantom. It'll buy us time for the real arrow of the law to hit its mark." The plan was set. The neighbors left, one by one, disappearing into the dark, a small conspiracy of hope. Ronan and May were left alone in the kitchen. The adrenaline of the plan was fading, leaving them exhausted. "You did well," Ronan said, the words heavy with meaning. "We did," she corrected. She turned to go to the loft. He turned to bank the fire. That's when they heard it. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a bell. It was a soft, heavy thud that shook the house. It was the sound of something striking the front door. Ronan had the Spencer in his hands before the sound faded. He motioned for May to get back, to the dark corner by the stove. He moved to the door, his body low, his boots silent on the pine floor. Whiskey was growling, a low, savage sound deep in his chest. Ronan didn't open the door. He stood beside it, his rifle aimed at the wood, listening. There was nothing, just the wind, the faint cry of a hawk. After a full minute, he reached out, slowly, and lifted the heavy bar. He cracked the door open an inch. Cold night air, the smell of pine. He opened it all the way. May gasped. There, quivering, embedded a full 2 inches deep in the solid oak of his front door, was a knife. It was a long, thin, Arkansas toothpick, a fighter's blade, its bone handle polished smooth. It had been thrown. Brecker. He had been here. Not at the fence, not in the gully, here, on the porch. He had been close enough to touch the house. The sound they heard was him, making his personal delivery. This wasn't a warning from Lorimer. This was a message from Holt Brecker. "I was here. I can get this close whenever I want." Ronan stared at the knife, his face turning to stone. The color drained from it. He turned to May. The fear was back, but it was a different kind. It wasn't for his ranch. It was for her. "No," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "This is done." He strode to her, grabbing her arm. His grip was hard, painful. "You can't stay. He was here. He could have." "Ronan. No, we're done. At first light. I'm taking you to Kestrel myself. I'll ride you to the judge's door. You'll be safe. This is my fight. But I won't have your death on my hands. I won't bury anyone else on that hill." He was back to being the widower, the man who protected himself by pushing the world away. He was trying to save her. May looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at his face, contorted in a grief and fear she knew all too well. She placed her hand on his. She didn't pull away. She covered his fist. No, she said. Her voice was not a whisper. It was as solid as the knife in the door. He looked at her, confused. What? I said, no. She met his gaze, and her eyes were not the eyes of a woman running. They were the eyes of the woman who had stared down a fire, who had braided a rope, who had faced an ambush. I've run enough, she said, her voice low and fierce. I ran from the fire. I ran from Lorimer. I ran here. I am done running. Ronan. He'll kill you, May. Then he'll have to do it here. She stepped closer to him, into his space. Don't you see this is my fight? But it's not just my fight anymore. He put red stakes on your land. He put a knife in your door. You took me in. You gave me shelter. You gave me a place to stand. She let go of his arm and walked past him. She went to the wall, to the small, dusty shrine, to the side saddle, to the cracked photograph of Alara. She stood before it, her back to him. You buried your wife, May said, her voice soft. And then you buried yourself right alongside her. I won't let you, and I won't run. Ronan Stroud watched her. He watched this woman, who had come to his gate in the rain, stand in his kitchen and give him back his own life. The love he felt for her was a painful, terrifying, brilliant thing. It was the thaw he had fought for 3 years. He walked to her. He did not stand behind her. He stood beside her. They faced the photograph of his wife together. He reached out his hand, palm up, into the space between them. A long moment passed. Then, May put her hand in his. Their fingers laced together. It was not a kiss. It was not an embrace. It was a contract, a clasp, a sealing of a vow. They stood before the memory of his past and made a promise for their future. Half the risk, he said, his voice raw. Half the fire, she finished, squeezing his hand. The sun was a sharp, cold razor. It slit the horizon, spilling a thin, yellow light across the frosty ground. The plan, the rumor, had been given a full day to seat itself in Barlow Bluff, carried by the blacksmith's heavy whispers and the widow's high-pitched complaints. Now, they had to lay the physical bait. He won't just believe a rumor, Ronan had said, checking the cinches on his saddle. Brecker's a man who follows sign. We have to give him sign to follow. The sign was a small, deliberate movement of cattle. Not the whole herd, just 30 head, enough to look like a man was scouting a new pasture. The destination was Cinder Pocket, the alkali spring Teller Dunn had described. The route was a tactical nightmare, deliberately chosen. They pushed the cattle out of the low pasture as the sun cleared the ridge, their hooves a dull, rhythmic thump-thump on the hard frozen earth. The lowing of the cows was a sound of protest, loud in the clean, cold air. May rode point, her gaze flicking between the cattle and the high rocks. Ronan rode drag, the Spencer carbine resting easy in the crook of his arm, his eyes never stopping, scanning, reading the land. They reached the first choke point, Needlegate. Ronan called it. It was a fissure in a sandstone ridge, a narrow, winding cut barely wide enough for a single horse to pass. The cattle, forced into a single-file line, panicked, their calls echoing, trapped between the high, red walls. This is the first lock on the door, Ronan said, his voice quiet as he rode up beside her. They follow one at a time. They can't rush us. May nodded, her gloved hand resting on her saddle horn. Her heart was a cold, hard knot in her chest. This was no longer defense. This was an invitation. She felt like a lure, tied to a line, being trolled through dangerous water. They cleared the pass, the cattle spilling out into a high, sun-drenched basin, and they saw them. 2 riders, a mile back, just emerging from the rocks, one on a pale gray horse. He's on us, May said, her voice dry. He was waiting, Ronan replied, no surprise in his voice. He saw us move the herd. Now we see how good he is. The chase began, but it was a slow, agonizing pursuit. Brecker wasn't running them down. He was tracking, letting them do the work, letting them lead him. He stayed a mile back, a persistent, patient shadow. They crossed the basin and started up a long, scree-covered slope. The sun was higher now, a bright, white disk. May reined in, letting the cattle pass. She reached into her saddlebag. Ronan didn't ask, he just watched. She pulled out a small, canvas-wrapped bundle. Inside were the shards of the broken photograph frame from the kitchen. Ilara's frame. She had gathered them, wrapping them carefully. Now, with a strange, cold sense of purpose, she scattered the pieces of glass onto the rocky trail. "What?" Ronan started. "Wait," she said. They rode on, another half-mile, to the crest of the slope. They looked back. Holt Brecker and his man were starting the climb. As their horses hit the patch of trail May had seeded, the sun caught the glass. The effect was immediate. From a mile away, they saw the flashes, tiny, brilliant stars of light exploding at the horses' feet. The animals, already nervous on the loose rock, shied violently. Brecker's gray horse reared, fighting the bit, nearly unseating him. "Sun fishing," Ronan breathed, a flicker of a smile on his face. A light trap. It bought them 10 minutes. 10 minutes of Brecker cursing, fighting his mount, and having to dismount to lead the horses past the glittering, treacherous ground. "He'll be angry now," Ronan said. He pointed. "This way. He'll try to cut us off through that ravine." He led them on a route that seemed to double back, a narrow game trail that wound along the side of a steep, wooded slope. The cattle protested, but May, using her horse with a new, hard-won confidence, pushed them through. As they moved, Ronan dismounted, pulling a thin coil of wire from his saddlebag. He strung it, just as he had at the ranch, between two pines, adding a single, small brass bell. He didn't string it to be hit, he strung it to be seen. They rode on. 20 minutes later, the faint, sharp jingle-jingle echoed up the slope. May looked back, confused. "He hit it." "No," Ronan said. "He found it. He's good. He saw the wire. He cut it. He's letting us know he's that good." The chase was no longer just a pursuit. It was a conversation, spoken in traps and triggers. Now, Brecker was closer. He was pushing them. The silent, patient stalk was over. It was a hunt. The world shrank. There was no more grand strategy. Only the next 5 seconds, the sounds of the chase became sharp, amplified in the thin air. May could hear the creak of Ronan's saddle leather as he shifted his weight. She could hear the heavy, rhythmic huff of her own horse's breathing, a hot plume of steam with every exhale. She could hear the slide and clatter of a dislodged rock as a calf slipped, and the sharp snort from Ronan's horse as he nudged it back in line. And then, a new sound. From the trees to their right, a sound that froze her blood, a faint, metallic click. The sound of a rifle hammer being pulled back to the half-cock position. Brecker was no longer behind them. He was parallel, moving through the timber, faster than they were, cutting the angle, looking for a clear shot. "Ronan," May breathed. "I hear him." Ronan's voice was a low growl. "Keep the cattle moving. Don't slow down. Don't look." They emerged from the trees into a wide, dry wash, a river of white sand and boulders. They were exposed. "Now, Ronan!" May yelled. From the trees on the far side, Brecker emerged, his gray horse scrambling down the bank. He was 200 yards away. He was raising his rifle. Ronan was faster. He had been waiting for this. He had the Spencer in his hands. He didn't lift it to his shoulder. He fired from the hip, a snapshot, an instinctive, violent calculation of wind and distance. Crack! The boom of the heavy carbine was flat and brutal. 200 yards away, Holt Brecker's hat exploded from his head, spinning 20 feet into the air before landing in the sand. Brecker froze, his own rifle half raised, his hand instinctively flying to his now bare head. It was a perfect shot, a declaration. I could have put this through your eye. I chose not to. A second of absolute, ringing silence. Brecker's face, when he lowered his hand, was a mask of sheer, white-hot fury. He snapped his rifle to his shoulder. He wasn't aiming at Ronan. He was aiming at May. "May, move!" Ronan yelled, working the lever. But Brecker fired. Crack zip! May felt it before she heard it. A sudden, violent tug at her head. A sound like a wet sheet being torn. The bullet had missed her face by an inch, ripping a clean, half-moon crescent out of the brim of her hat. She didn't flinch. She didn't duck. She just sat, frozen, as the sound echoed. Then, slowly, she raised her gloved hand and touched the torn, dangling piece of felt. She looked at Ronan. She looked back at Brecker, and she squared her shoulders. She would not give him the satisfaction. "Good God, May," Ronan whispered, his face pale. "Now!" a new voice boomed from the rocks above them. It was Boaz McKendry. He was waiting for them at Boulder Step, a sheer 40-foot drop of slick rock that the trail wound beneath. As Brecker and his man spurred their horses forward, furious, Boaz put his massive shoulder to a heavy 50-gallon barrel. It wasn't a rock. It was a barrel of pine tar from his smithy. It rumbled, tumbling down the rock face, hit the trail, and split open. A great, black, viscous wave of sticky pine tar flooded the narrow path. Brecker and his man, coming fast, had no time to stop. Their horses hit the slick at a full canter. It was chaos. Horses screamed as their hooves found no purchase. Brecker's gray went down, sliding on its haunches, pitching Brecker over its head into a patch of prickly pear. The other rider's horse spun, slipped, and fell, trapping the man's leg beneath it. "The bait!" Ronan yelled. May had it ready. The small canvas bag, weighted with a rock. Tied to it with a leather thong was the fake map to Cinder Pocket, the one she had painstakingly drawn, complete with false landmarks and a big promising X. She rode to the edge of the wash, and with a desperate cry, she threw it. No, the map. The bag landed in the sand, 20 feet from the struggling, cursing men, exactly where Brecker would have to pass to recover. "Boaz now," Ronan yelled. Boaz, Ronan, and May turned their horses, not toward Cinder Pocket, but into a narrow, hidden canyon to the left. They plunged into the shadows, their horses' hooves muffled by the deep sand. They rode hard for 15 minutes, the sounds of cursing and a horse's pain neighing fading behind them. They didn't stop until they reached their own ridge, a high point that overlooked the entire basin. They dismounted, their sides heaving, and crawled to the edge. A mile away, they watched the scene. Brecker had freed his horse. The other man was limping, but free. They were a mess, covered in black tar and dust. They watched as Brecker saw the bag. He limped to it. He tore the map free. He unrolled it. He stood for a long, long time, staring at it. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the landscape. He looked toward Cinder Pocket. In the north, he looked toward the Stroud Ranch. In the south. Then, with a roar of pure, unadulterated rage that they almost felt a mile away, he crumpled the map in his fist. He had taken the bait. He believed it. But he didn't ride for Cinder Pocket. He and his man, limping, mounted up and began the long ride back toward Barlow Bluff. Boaz nodded, spitting into the dust. He's bit. He believes the map is real, and he knows he can't take you three. He's going back to get Pike Lorimer. He's going to bring all of them. Boaz rode back to town, to play his part, to spread the story of the fight. Ronan and May were left alone at the corral, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a cold, heavy exhaustion. The real fight was coming. Ronan moved to the horses, his movements stiff. He began to check the Spencer, methodically ejecting the spent shells, reloading the magazine, his hands steady. He looked at May. She was just standing there, her hand still at her side, her hat with its torn brim still on her head. A streak of black tar was smeared on her cheek, where she had wiped away sweat. He finished loading the rifle. He looked at her, at the torn hat, at the grit, at the absolute, unshakable courage in her eyes. He reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a folded cloth. It wasn't a fancy silk, just a simple cotton kerchief. It was a faded, mossy green, the color of pine needles in the shade. "Here," he said, his voice rough. She looked at the cloth. The dust will be bad tomorrow. When they come." He held it out to her. He paused, struggling for the words. "And it's a good color, a quiet color, so I can find you, in the smoke." She took it from him. Her fingers, cold and stiff, brushed his calloused palm. She didn't say thank you. She just held the small, soft piece of green cloth, a small patch of life in the dusty, gray world. Night fell. It fell fast, like a lid being clamped on a box. The wind, which had been still all day, began to pick up. It had a new smell. It wasn't just dust and pine. It was the sharp, metallic smell of ozone, the smell of distant rain. And with it, from the far-off ridges, came the first low, deep rumble. It wasn't a whistle this time. It was thunder. It was the sound of a heavy-laden, dark sky. It was the sound of drums, signaling the final battle. The thunder was no longer a distant threat. It was a war. It cracked directly overhead, a deafening split in the fabric of the sky, and the rain followed like a volley of grape shot. It hammered the tin roof of the barn with a sound so loud it was a physical weight, a constant, violent roar that drowned all thought. They were trapped, not in the house, but in the barn, having made a final, desperate run to check the livestock and bar the heavy doors. The yard, in the brief flashes of lightning, was already a churning lake of red mud. The storm lantern, hanging from a low beam, swung in the drafts, casting their shadows long and wild against the stalls. The air inside was thick, a pressurized pocket of animal heat, the sweet, dusty smell of 1,000 bales of hay, and the sharp, clean scent of the pine timbers. It smelled of life. They stood in the central aisle, dripping, panting. The run from the house had plastered their clothes to them. The cold was secondary to the adrenaline. But now, in the relative quiet, the shivering started. You're freezing." Ronan's voice was a low rumble, almost lost in the din. He turned, pulling 2 heavy wool saddle blankets from a dry rail. They were stiff, smelling of horse and leather, but they were dry. He tossed one to May and began to roughly scrub at his own face and hair, his movements hard and practical. May caught the blanket. She started to dry her own hair, her fingers fumbling, her whole body starting to shake in a violent, uncontrollable tremor. It was the cold, the fear, the exhaustion, all of it hitting at once. Ronan stopped, his own hair half dry, water running in rivulets from his beard. He saw her. He stepped forward, his boots silent in the deep straw. "Here." His voice was gruff. He took the blanket from her unresisting hands and draped it over her shoulders, pulling the edges together, creating a tent of warmth. "Stop that." He was all business. He began to dry her arms with the edges of the blanket, his touch rough, impersonal. He was just a man trying to stop a woman from freezing. But then, as he rubbed the coarse wool over her forearms, his hand, large and calloused, covered her own. He was trying to chafe warmth back into her fingers. His thumb, rough as sandstone, accidentally brushed the pale, sensitive skin of her inner wrist, just below the glove line. May let out a sharp, tiny gasp, as if he'd touched her with a hot coal. Her entire body went rigid. The shivering didn't stop. It just froze. She was a bowstring pulled taut, humming with a vibration that was suddenly not from the cold at all. Ronan felt it. He stopped, his hand still covering her wrist. The roar of the rain on the roof seemed to fade. the world shrinking to the few inches of space between them. He didn't let go. He just held her wrist, feeling the frantic bird-wing pulse beneath his thumb. She didn't pull away. She didn't move. She just looked at his hand, at the dark, clean lines, the scarred knuckles. Then, slowly, as if in a trance, she lifted her other hand. It hovered in the air between them for a heartbeat. She didn't touch his face. She didn't touch his chest. She touched his side, her cold fingers resting on the flannel over his ribs. He flinched, a small, involuntary tightening. Her hand was light, her touch questioning. She was searching for something. Her fingers, made sensitive by the cold, moved, tracing the line of his ribs through the thick, damp cloth. She found it. A long, thick, ropey ridge of scar tissue, just beneath his heart. It was an old wound, a break in the smooth armor of his body. She'd heard the story in town. A 2-year-old bull, a snapped cedar fence post, and Ronan, found hours later, trying to drag himself back to the house, his hand pressed over the wound. "The post," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Ronan's own breathing stopped. He said nothing. His body was tense as iron, but he didn't move. He let her. He stood, exposed in the lantern light, his hand still on her wrist, and let her fingers read the hidden history of his body, the testament of his long, lonely fight to simply endure. Her touch changed. It was no longer curious. It became tender. Her fingers softened, tracing the length of the scar with a profound, aching gentleness, as if she could soothe the old, cold pain away. She took a step closer. She let her head rest against his chest, her cheek pressed to the damp flannel, right over the scar. She could feel the steady, powerful thump of his heart beneath her ear. It was the loudest thing in the barn. She closed her eyes. "Ronan," she breathed. That one word, his name, spoken not in fear or in need, but in simple, quiet recognition, was his undoing. His hand released her wrist. His arms, heavy as timber, came up and wrapped around her, pulling her in. He crushed her to him, his arms locking at the small of her back. He buried his face in her damp hair, his hand tangling in the heavy, wet strands. Holding her head to his chest, he inhaled. She smelled of the storm, of wood smoke, and of the dry, papery scent of the ledgers she guarded. She smelled of his new, terrifying, improbable life. It wasn't a comforting embrace. It was an embrace of desperation, of a man who had been starving for 3 years and had just been given bread. He held her as if she were the only thing keeping the roof from caving in, the only thing keeping the storm at bay. May's own arms, which had been trapped between them, now wrapped around his waist. Her hands splayed wide against the hard, broad muscles of his back, holding him just as tightly. She was not a refugee being sheltered. She was an anchor, holding him fast. He leaned back, his hands moving to frame her face, forcing her to look at him. His gray eyes, usually so flat, were now a turbulent storm, dark and deep and raw. His gaze dropped to her mouth. His voice, when he spoke, was a ragged whisper. "May." It was a question. It was a plea. It was a warning. This is the line. This is the last chance to turn back. She answered him without words. She rose up on her toes. Her hands, which had been on his back, slid up his chest, over his shoulders, and cupped the back of his neck. She pulled his face down to hers. The kiss was an explosion. It was the thunder, and the lightning, and the driving rain, all centered in one desperate point of contact. It wasn't the chaste, safe press of the porch. It was a kiss of hunger, of shared fear, of a profound, animal need to affirm life in the face of what was coming. It was the taste of salt, and the cold metal of the rain, and the heat of his skin, and it was overwhelming. He pressed her back, his body shielding hers, until she was pinned against one of the massive wooden support beams of the barn. He trapped her there, not with force, but with a sudden, undeniable weight. His hands were in her hair, his mouth on hers, his body a solid wall, his shoulders, which he always held rigid. Finally, let go. They slumped, just a fraction, as the tension of 3 years of solitude broke. He tore his mouth away, resting his forehead against hers. They were both panting, their breath pluming white in the cold air, their hearts hammering against each other, a frantic, shared rhythm. "I warned you," he gasped, his eyes closed. "Not to bring trouble." "You," she whispered back, her own voice shaky, "are the trouble, Ronan Stroud." A sound, half groan, half laugh, rumbled in his chest. He kissed her again, but the desperation was gone, replaced by a deep, slow thoroughness that was almost more devastating. His hand slid from her hair, down her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He looked at her, his eyes asking another, deeper question. May, her gaze locked on his, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the new rhythm, a look, a pause, an answer. Consent, given and received in the silent language they were building. He leaned in again, his lips parting, and in that same instant, a new sound cut through the roar of the storm. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't the wind. It was the faint, sharp, unmistakable clink of a horseshoe hitting the stone of the creek bed. They both froze. In a fraction of a second, the heat evaporated. The air between them, which had been electric, turned to ice. Ronan's head snapped up. He was no longer the lover. His eyes went flat, hard, and cold. He was the soldier. He was the widower. He was the man who had shot the hat off Holt Brecker's head. He didn't step away from her. He just pressed his forehead to hers one last time. The heat was still there, a banked ember, but their minds had shifted. The world had rushed back in, from this to that, from life to survival. May let out a single, shaky breath. She pushed, gently, against his chest. He let her go. The cold air rushed into the space between them. May turned, just for a second, her back to him, composing herself. Her hands, which had been tangled in his hair, were shaking. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the moss-green kerchief he had given her. With swift, efficient, angry motions, she gathered her hair and tied it back, tight. Ronan watched her. He watched her pull the front of her flannel shirt closed, her fingers moving surely, one by one, buttoning it right up to her throat. As she armed herself in her way, he armed himself in his. He turned to the barrel where he had left his gun belt and the Spencer. He settled the heavy leather of the belt on his hips, the weight familiar, a comfort. He checked the loads in his revolver, spinning the cylinder once. He slung the carbine's leather strap over his shoulder. In that one silent moment, the soft, vulnerable, desperate people in the barn had vanished. The steel had returned. May turned to face him. Her face was pale, her eyes huge in the lantern light, the black smudge of tar still on her cheek. A small, grim smile touched her lips. "We will finish this later." Ronan's own mouth quirked. He nodded, a single, sharp gesture. "After this." He grabbed the lantern. Lifting it, "We hold the house. It's better cover." "The loft window in the front room," May said, her voice crisp. "All business. It has the high ground. I can see the gate and the creek bed. I'll take the porch. I'll draw their fire. You don't shoot until I do. Wait for my shot." "Understood." He moved to the massive, sliding barn door. May right beside him. He put his hand on the heavy wooden bar. She stood next to him, her rifle in her hand. For one brief, terrible second, as they braced to re-enter the war, their shoulders touched, back to back. It was a wordless, final promise. "I am here. I have your back." Ronan lifted the bar. the wood scraping, and pulled the door open a few inches. The roar of the storm, the wet, cold wind, flooded in, and with it, sharp and clear, came the sound they had been dreading. Bark, 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 bark! It was Whiskey, on the porch, not a growl. It was his high, frantic, three-part alarm. The enemy was not at the creek. The enemy was in the yard. Ronan didn't hesitate. He kicked the door wide. Run! May! Now! They burst from the warm, golden light of the barn into the screaming, dark chaos of the storm. The battle was upon them. The dawn broke gray and cold, tasting of wet ash. The night had been a long, rolling siege. Not a full attack, but a series of probes, of single riders testing the bell lines, of shots fired from the darkness that Ronan had answered with the steady, booming reply of the Spencer. They had not slept. They had spent the hours since their embrace in the barn as soldiers, moving from window to window, their bodies aching, their hearts wired for a fight. The rain had stopped, leaving the world a sea of red, sucking mud. Ronan, his face a mask of exhaustion, was watching the eastern ridge. He's waiting for light, he breathed, his voice raw. He'll bring them all at sunup. May, at the front window, her rifle resting on the sill, saw it first. Not an army, a single rider, pushing his horse hard through the mud, a dark shape against the pale. Sick sky. Ronan, she said, her voice tight. Who is that? He squinted. The man was riding a post horse, not a ranch horse. He carried a leather dispatch case. That's the mail circuit rider. He's 2 days late. As they watched, a second figure emerged from the rocks on the ridge, moving to intercept the post rider, a lean man on a pale gray horse. Holt Brecker, May whispered. They watched, helpless, a half-mile away. They saw Brecker raise his hand. They saw the post rider pull up, his horse skittish. An argument? Brecker grabbed for the dispatch case. The rider tried to spur his horse away. A single flat crack echoed across the valley. The post rider crumpled, falling from his saddle into the mud. Brecker dismounted, grabbed the dispatch case, and slung it over his own shoulder. May's heart stopped. The letter, she gasped. Ronan, that was my letter. That was the injunction. Ronan said nothing. His face was stone. Brecker had just raised the stakes from a land dispute to murder. Brecker, holding the case, turned and looked down, across the valley, directly at the ranch house. He knew they were watching. He held the case up, a dark silhouette, then turned his horse and disappeared back into the rocks. Cut to Barlow Bluff, the Silver Slipper Saloon. The saloon was packed, not with drinkers, but with the grim, curious faces of the town. At the front, the main poker table had been dragged onto the small stage, a Bible placed on it. Judge Kestrel, who had arrived on a hard-riding stagecoach an hour before, slammed his gavel. He was a small, wire-thin man with a beard like iron filings and eyes that missed nothing. This court is in session, he boomed, his voice cutting through the murmuring. This is an emergency hearing on a writ of injunction. Callahan versus Lorimer. I have read the plaintiff's affidavit. I have read the defendant's summons. He glared at the empty chair beside the table. And I note the defendant, Mr. Pike Lorimer, has chosen not to attend. A nervous cough from the back. He rode out early, Your Honor, with about 10 men. Said he was surveying. Kestrel's eyes narrowed. Surveying. We'll see. Miss Martha Quill, you will be sworn. Martha Quill, in her gray starched dress, placed her hand on the Bible, her face impassive. Cut to the Stroud Ranch, the barn. You can't. Ronan's voice was flat, final. He stood in the doorway of the barn, blocking her. He murdered that man, Ronan. May was frantic, throwing a saddle onto her gray mare. Ash? He has the injunction. If he destroys it. He has 10 men. He has Holt Brecker. You ride out there. You're dead before you clear the gate. It's suicide. May. It's the only way. Her hands were shaking, but she forced the cinch, pulling it tight. The law, it's the only thing they'll listen to. I have to get that paper. Ronan looked at her, at the desperate, furious set of her jaw. He saw the woman from the storm. He saw the woman from the chase. He let out a long, ragged breath. He turned his head. Boaz, he bellowed. The blacksmith, who had returned in the pre-dawn darkness with Teller and Inez, emerged from a stall, his face grim. The south pasture, Ronan said, his voice clipped, fast. The wet straw, all of it, by the creek bed, now. Boaz understood. He ran. Ronan turned back to May. He grabbed her horse's bridle. Brecker will be on that ridge. He'll see you come. He'll shoot you from 500 yards. Then he'll have to be a good shot, she said, putting her boot in the stirrup. I'll give you smoke, Ronan said, his hand on her leg, stopping her. His gray eyes were desperate. Wait for the smoke. Ride like hell. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just get the case. She looked down at his hand, then at his face. She nodded. She sat in the saddle, low, her hands tight on the reins. They waited. 1 minute, 2. Then, from the creek bed to the south, a massive, billowing column of thick, white, acrid smoke began to pour into the sky. The wind was stiff, carrying it east, right toward the ridge where Brecker was hidden. Now, May, Ronan slapped the horse's rump. Go! Ash exploded from the barn, her hooves throwing great clods of mud. May leaned low over the mare's neck, becoming one with the horse, a gray streak against the red earth. On the ridge, Holt Brecker heard the horse. He moved to his vantage point. He saw her coming. He smiled. An easy shot. He raised his rifle. And the smoke hit him. A wall of it, thick and choking. It enveloped the ridge in seconds. He was blind, coughing, his eyes streaming. Damn you, Stroud! He roared, firing blind into the white oblivion. May rode into the smoke, a ghost disappearing into a cloud. Cut to Barlow Bluff, the hearing. And this, Martha Quill's voice was clear, cutting, is the official certified survey map from the land office. As you can see, Your Honor, the boundary line, established in 1852, clearly follows the main body of Juniper Wash. Song Swallow Rock is, and always has been, part of the Callahan deed. She laid the ledger copy beside it. And this is the record of payment. Note, advance against water rights, not collateral for loan. Pike Lorimer did not buy that land. He defrauded Mr. Callahan of it. He bought the debt, then created the default. Judge Kestrel stared at the papers, his face like granite. He's turned a water lease into a land seizure, a clear, fraudulent conversion. Cut to the Stroud Ranch, the gate. The thud of hooves. Not one, but many. Pike Lorimer reined in. His horse, a big black gelding, dancing nervously. 10 riders, hard men with their dusters pulled back to clear their holsters. Fanned out behind him, a dark, grim crescent. Stroud. Lorimer's voice was a bull roar. The game is over. I've filed my new survey. He pointed to the wet, red stakes that gleamed in the morning light. This is my land. Send the girl and her book out, and I'll let you walk away. Ronan stepped out onto the porch. The Spencer held casually in one hand, its muzzle pointed at the ground. This land is mine, Pike. Ronan's voice was quiet, but it carried. Deeded and paid for. Those stakes are trash. Get off my property. You and who else? Lorimer sneered. Me, Ronan said. The standoff was absolute. 10 guns against 1. The gate, the place where May had stood, was the line. Cut to Barlow Bluff, the hearing. Call Lark Delaney, Kestrel ordered. Lark, pale and terrified, his banjo held like a shield, took the stand. I swear, Your Honor. Mr. Delaney, tell the court what you told me this morning, what you overheard in this very saloon. Lark swallowed. It was 2 months back. After the fire, I was playing. Over in the corner, Mr. Lorimer. He was buying drinks for 2 men drifters. He was laughing. Lark's voice dropped. He said, "A little fire clears up a lot of bad accounts." And he gave them a poke, a heavy one. I saw the gold. He said, "That's for cleaning out the Callahan mill. Good work, boys." A collective, sharp intake of breath in the saloon. This wasn't fraud. This was arson. This was a hanging offense. Cut to the ridge. The smoke. May found the post rider. He was alive, barely, a gut shot. The dispatch case was gone. He went south, the man whispered, his face gray. Bleeding my horse lamed. May saw the trail. Holt's horse, the pale gray, had stepped in a hole, lamed by the blind ride. He was on foot, and he was bleeding. The post rider had gotten a shot off. May rode Ash, slow, tracking him. She found him a 1/4 mile away, slumped against a rock, trying to tie a tourniquet around his thigh. The dispatch case was at his feet. He heard her. He raised his revolver. "Get back, bitch." May just looked at him. She didn't have her rifle. "It's over. Brecker, the law is coming." "The law," he spat, and raised the gun again. Cut to the Stroud Ranch, the gate. "I'm done talking. Stroud?" Lorimer was snarling. He was about to give the order. "Hold." A new voice. A lone rider, a man with a tin star on his vest, was pushing his horse through Lorimer's men. It was Deputy Clay. "Mr. Lorimer, there's a hearing. Judge Kestrel is in town. He summoned you." Lorimer laughed. "I don't answer to Kestrel. This is my land." "Mr. Lorimer, I'm ordering you to disperse." "You ain't ordering nothing. Deputy, you're out here alone." "He's not alone." All heads snapped. May, she was riding Ash down the main path. Hard. She held the leather dispatch case high. Holt Brecker was nowhere to be seen. She reined in beside the stunned deputy, her face smeared with smoke and dirt. "Deputy Clay, this is for you from Judge Kestrel. It's an emergency injunction." She threw the case at him. He fumbled it, tore it open. He unrolled the paper. He saw the seal. The deputy's face changed. He sat up straight, his hand moving from his holster to rest on the paper. "Mr. Lorimer, this is a lawful writ, signed by the judge. It says you and your men are to cease all interference with the Callahan property and the Stroud property, pending a full investigation. You are ordered to remove your stakes. You are ordered to disperse. Immediately." Lorimer's men shuffled, their horses moving. This was no longer a fight with a rancher. This was contempt of court. Lorimer's face was purple. "It's a piece of paper. He's one man ride him down." "He's right," a voice rasped. Holt Brecker, limping, bleeding, his face a mask of black smoke and white rage, had stumbled out of the trees. He held his rifle. He wasn't aiming at May. He was aiming at Ronan. Crack. Holt fired. Ronan, who had been moving off the porch, dove. He didn't duck. He dove. Just as the bullet hit the thick oak porch post where his head had been, the wood exploded in a shower of splinters. Ronan hit the mud and rolled, coming up in the shadow of the horse trough. Holt worked his rifle's action, swiveling, trying to find him, to finish him. Crack! It was Ronan, firing the Spencer from the mud. He hadn't aimed at Brecker's chest. He aimed at his rifle. The heavy slug hit the Spencer's stock, right at the action. The rifle disintegrated in Holt's hands, a catastrophic explosion of wood and steel. Holt screamed, dropping the ruined weapon. His hands a bloody mess of splinters. He was disarmed. Lorimer lost his mind. "Ah!" with a roar of pure animal rage. He dug his spurs into his black gelding, charging straight at May and the deputy. "May!" Ronan yelled, but he was too far. The deputy fumbled for his gun, but something else was faster. A gray, muzzled blur shot from under the porch. Whiskey, the old dog, silent until now, launched himself, his teeth, worn but strong, clamping down on the charging horse's foreleg. The horse screamed, rearing, spinning in pain. It spun directly into May's horse. May didn't panic. As the horse reared, its reins flailed. May, with the reflexes of a mill worker, grabbed the leather, yanking down with all her weight. The horse, attacked by the dog, yanked by May, and unbalanced by Lorimer, went down. It crashed into the mud, pinning Lorimer's leg underneath it. And in that exact moment of chaos, jingle, jingle, jingle. The bell trap, the original one, at the back fence. Lorimer's men, stunned, turned. On the ridge, stepping out from the rocks, were Boaz McKendry, Teller Dunn, and the widow Inez, all three holding rifles, flanking the riders. Cut to Barlow Bluff, the hearing. Judge Kestrel's face was white. Arson, fraud, murder of a post rider, contempt. He slammed his gavel down, the sound like a gunshot. This court finds sufficient cause. I am issuing a warrant for the temporary seizure of all Lorimer assets, cattle and property, pending a full investigation, and I am issuing a warrant for the arrest of Pike Lorimer and one Holt Brecker. Cut to the Stroud Ranch, the gate. The standoff was total. Lorimer was trapped. Holt was bleeding. The 10 riders were surrounded, caught between Ronan at the trough, the deputy, and Boaz's rifles on the ridge. Then came a new sound, the sound of a column of horses, riding hard. The county sheriff, followed by 6 armed deputies, crested the hill. They had been riding out to serve the summons. They arrived to find the battle already won. The sheriff took in the scene, the injunction in his deputy's hand, Lorimer, pinned and defeated, Holt, clutching his bloody hands, the armed neighbors. He drew his revolver. He looked at the gate, the closed gate. It was no longer just a fence. It was the line of the law. To cross it now was a felony. Pike Lorimer, the sheriff's voice boomed. In the name of the law, this is over. Lorimer, his face in the mud, trapped under his own horse, looked at the guns. He looked at the badges. He looked at May, who had dismounted and was standing over him, the injunction still in the deputy's hand. He let out a long, ragged sigh. The fight was gone. He let go of his reins and slowly raised his one free hand. The rain began again. It was not the driving, violent siege that had first brought her to his gate. It was not the thunderous, concussive downpour that had masked their battle in the barn. This was a different rain. It was a soft, vertical, almost silent mist, a rain that had no anger in it. It was a rain of cleansing, falling on the churned-up mud of the yard, on the splintered wood of the porch post, and on the defeated men who were being bound. The war was over. The silence it left behind was vast, hollow, and ringing. Pike Lorimer, his face a mask of mud and disbelief, was hauled to his feet, his leg unbroken but his spirit shattered. The sheriff, his voice a dull monotone that cut through the misty air, read the warrant, the words systematic fraud, conspiracy, arson, and attempted murder fell on the yard, each one a nail in the coffin of Lorimer's empire. Holt Brecker sat on the ground, his back against a wagon wheel, his ruined, splintered hands wrapped in bloody rags. He stared at nothing, a man whose entire world of precision and pursuit had been undone. A deputy snapped the iron cuffs over his wrists, and the sharp, final snick-snick of the lock was the only sound. And at the gate where the story had begun, May Callahan stood and watched. She still wore the cloak, the one she had arrived in, soaked and heavy, but it was no longer the shroud of a refugee. It was a mantle. Her hair, tied back with the moss-green kerchief, was plastered to her head, and the black Angry smudge of tar was still on her cheek. She just stood, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing slow, as she watched her past being led away in irons. Ronan was beside her, not touching, but close enough for her to feel his warmth. He had walked from the trough, the Spencer carbine held loosely in one hand, a long, red scratch, a gift from the splintered porch post, ran from his cheekbone to his jaw. It was a bright, stark mark of the fight, but his eyes, which had been the color of dead ash and solitude, were clear and sharp and intensely bright. He wasn't watching the prisoners. He was watching May. A new sound made them both turn. A single horse, moving at a steady, official trot, came up the road. It was another deputy, this one fresh from Barlow Bluff, his slicker clean. He carried a sealed oilskin packet. "Sheriff," the man called, reining in. "This just came. Judge Kestrel's final ruling, based on the hearing." The sheriff took the packet and broke the seal. He unrolled the paper. Lorimer, standing cuffed by his horse, watched, a deadness in his eyes. The sheriff cleared his throat. He read, his voice now loud, a proclamation for the assembled neighbors for Boaz, Inez, and Teller, who had come down from the ridge. "By order of the Territorial Court," he read. "The survey map filed by Pike Lorimer is declared null and void, found to be based on willful and systematic fraud. The original deed of the Callahan Mill, including all water rights pertaining to the main body of Juniper Wash and the Song Swallow Rock marker, is hereby affirmed and restored, in perpetuity, to its sole living heir, May Callahan." May's knees buckled. A sound, a small, choked sob that was half laugh, tore from her throat. Ronan's hand shot out, his arm wrapping around her waist, holding her steady. She leaned into him, her face pressed against his soaked, muddy shirt, her shoulders shaking as the weight of her entire life, her father's fight, the fire, the running, as it all finally fell away. The sheriff continued. "All debts recorded by Lorimer against the Callahan Mill are ruled fraudulent. A full seizure of all Lorimer assets is authorized, to be auctioned to make restitution, first, to Miss Callahan, and second, to all other landholders affected by his illegal water diversion." Inez Hollow, the old widow, let out a cry and sank onto a log, her face in her hands. Boaz the blacksmith let out a roar of triumph, clapping Teller on the back so hard the prospector stumbled. It was over. Not just May's fight, all of their fights. Slowly, May straightened, pulling away from Ronan's support, though his hand remained at the small of her back. She was no longer crying. She was finished. She walked to her horse, Ash, who stood trembling nearby. She unstrapped the heavy leather satchel, her burden, her father's legacy. She walked back to the gate, her boots making sucking sounds in the mud. Ronan watched her. The deputies were mounting, preparing to move the prisoners. The neighbors were talking, their voices loud and bright with relief. But Ronan and May were in their own world, a small bubble of silence by the gate. May placed the satchel on the wet top bar of the fence. She unbuckled it. Ronan expected her to take out the ledger, the book that had started it all. She didn't. She reached deep inside, past the ledger, past the maps. She pulled out something small. It was a single, 3-foot length of faded, pale blue ribbon, the kind a miller might have used to tie a special order of bolted flour, or the kind a young girl might have worn in her hair. It was a simple, fragile piece of her childhood, of the life before the debt, before the fire. Ronan watched, his heart in his throat. May turned to the gate. She didn't look at the main bar. She looked at the heavy iron latch pin, the one Ronan had dropped into its bracket that first night, the sound that had locked her in. With her fingers, still raw and trembling slightly, she threaded the blue ribbon through the iron loop of the pin. The bright, delicate, almost frivolous color was a stark, beautiful contrast to the cold, black, utilitarian iron. She tied it in a simple, firm bow. It was a small, quiet act. It was the act of a woman hanging a curtain. It was the act of a woman setting a flower on a table. It was the act of a woman claiming a house. She was no longer a prisoner of the gate. She was its mistress. The deputies began to move out. The sound of a dozen horses, the clink of harness, the low curses of the prisoners, all filled the air. The cavalcade of justice began its march down the road, away from the ranch. Ronan and May stood and watched them go. They watched until the last rider disappeared into the mist. The road was empty. The world was clean. The only sounds were the soft, steady dripping of the rain from the eaves, and the sudden, loud, happy pant, pant, pant of old Whiskey, who had trotted out from under the porch and sat at their feet, his tongue lolling, his tail thumping against the mud. Ronan looked at the blue ribbon fluttering in the rain. He turned to May. His voice was hoarse, rough from the smoke and the shouting. "You can stay," he said, the words almost catching in his throat. He touched the scratch on his cheek, his eyes never leaving hers. "You can stay if you don't intend to bury your heart under a fence line, the way I did." May looked up at him, at this man who had been a fortress of solitude and was now, finally, an open door. She saw the fear still in his eyes, not fear of Holt Brecker, but the old fear, the fear of losing what he had just fought to win. She stepped closer, closing the last bit of distance between them. She reached up and laid her hand, her small, calloused, capable hand, against the rough stubble of his unscratched cheek. "I'm staying," she whispered, her voice as firm as the bow she had tied. "I'm staying to live, Ronan, not to hide." He let out the breath he had been holding for 3 years. He lowered his head, and she rose to meet him. They kissed. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the barn. It was not the chaste, fragile kiss of the porch. This was a kiss of sealing. It was a kiss of contract. It was as deep and as solid as the roots of the sycamore tree. It was a kiss that tasted of the whole, long fight. It tasted of gunpowder, a faint, metallic memory of the battle. It tasted of the clean, sharp, biting smell of wood smoke, the ghost of her father's mill and his burning pasture, and it tasted of the rain, a cold, pure, cleansing flavor that washed the other two away, leaving only the simple, honest warmth of their own skin. His arms went around her, pulling her tight, and hers went around him, and they stood in the mud, by the gate, under the open sky, and staked their claim. This was the new territory. It wasn't the pastures. It wasn't the water rights. It was the land they stood on, the small, sacred ground of each other's hearts. They broke apart, slow and reluctant, resting their foreheads together. The world was quiet. Whiskey, at their feet, let out a happy, sighing woof. Ronan smiled, the first, true, easy smile May had ever seen on his face. It transformed him. He kept one arm around her waist, and with his other hand, he reached for the gate. He didn't bar it. He didn't lock it. His fingers found the heavy, wooden bar, the one with her blue ribbon now tied to it. He lifted it from its brackets. He pulled the gate open, wide. It scraped a new, clean arc in the mud. Inside was the dark, wet yard. Inside was the porch, and the one, single, yellow light from the kitchen window, waiting for them. It was no longer a light that accused. It was a beacon. Ronan looked at her, his eyes full. He nodded toward the house. Together, side by side, they stepped over the threshold. They crossed the line from the world of survival into the world of a life. From inside the yard, the heavy gate, pushed by the wind, swung slowly, quietly shut behind them. The bar, unlatched, hung loose. The blue ribbon fluttered once, twice, in the steady, gentle, and promising rain. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We truly appreciate you spending your time with us. We would love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please leave a comment below to tell us your city or country so we can all share this experience together. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to support us further, please press that hype button to help this story reach even more listeners. We'll see you in the next one.